There is a room somewhere in the world tonight where a small lamp is burning, and the air is warm, and a book lies open on a table with its pages slightly curled from the humidity of a long summer. Someone has just left the room. The chair is still faintly warm, and if you were to stand at the doorway and look inside, you would notice something strange. The room does not miss anyone, it simply is. The light continues, the dust continues, the quiet continues, and for nearly 14 billion years, that was the shape of your existence too. A room without you in it, a universe carrying on, gently, patiently, without any ache at all. And here you are now, listening. Somehow assembled, somehow awake. Welcome. If these long, slow journeys through wonder help you rest, a quiet follow on the channel means the next one finds you when you need it. For those of us whose minds do not switch off easily, there is a slower conversation continuing in the quiet room. On Patreon, the deeper currents beneath these nights, the thoughts the algorithm buries, the sense that there is always something more beneath what a single video can hold. The link is in the description if you ever want to sink further. Tonight, we walk gently through the long dark that came before you, the vastness that asked nothing of you and left no wound. There is a number that follows you through your life, though you may never have noticed it. 13.8 billion years. It is the age of the universe, more or less, as best we have been able to measure it, and for almost all of that time, every single year, every century, every unimaginable millennium, you are not here, not a body, not a name, not even a possibility with an address. And yet, remarkably, you endured it without discomfort. You slept through it, in a sense, though there was no you to sleep. Somehow, the longest absence you will ever know has already happened, and you survived it perfectly. Let the number breathe for a moment. 13.8 billion, not 13,000, not 13 million, billion. If you tried to count each year at 1 per second, without pausing to eat or sleep or grieve, you would need more than 400,000 human lifetimes just to reach the beginning. The mind cannot really hold that. It brushes against it, the way a hand brushes against deep water and then pulls back. We arrived at that figure slowly, through instruments so gentle they can hear the faint warmth still lingering from the earliest moments of the cosmos. There is a soft glow in every direction of the sky, a background hum of light left over from a time when the universe was young and dense and hot. In the early 2000s, a mission called Planck listened to that hum with quiet patience, mapping tiny fluctuations of temperature across the whole sky, and from those small ripples, cosmologists could infer the age of everything. That is where the number comes from. Not a guess, not a story, a measurement of leftover warmth. But statistics can numb us. So let us turn the number sideways for a moment, and consider it not as data, but as duration, as lived time, though no one lived it. For 13.8 billion years, galaxies drifted, stars ignited and quietly went out, planets cooled, oceans formed on worlds that will never have names, and in all of that, there was no version of you watching, no one waiting in a hallway, no small self hovering, impatient to be born. There was simply an unfolding, enormous, unhurried, and profoundly kind in its indifference. And here is the softest realization to rest inside tonight. You endured all of that, every uncountable moment of it, and it did not hurt. It did not press against you. It did not feel long. It did not feel anything at all, because there was no you to feel it, and that, perhaps, is the first small piece of comfort the long dark offers. Because if you can endure 13.8 billion years of not existing without a single moment of pain, then maybe the mind, when it worries about the vast quiet on either side of a life, is worrying about something it has already survived. The absence has already happened. It was longer than anything ahead of you. And still, here you are, listening to a voice in the dark, with a heart beating quietly in a room that does not know how strange it is to be a room at all. Try, for a moment, to remember what it felt like to not exist. Not what it felt like before you can remember being a child. That is different. Try to remember what it felt like 100 years ago, or 1,000, or 1,000,000. Reach for it, and notice how your mind slides off the surface of the question like water off glass. There is nothing to grip, no texture, no dark, no stillness. There is not even absence, because absence still needs someone to notice it. This is the strange truth at the center of tonight. Nothingness has no feeling, because feeling requires a someone. There must be a subject, a small warm point of view, a candle inside the room. Without that candle, the room does not feel dark, it does not feel anything, and for almost 14 billion years, there was no candle where you now are. A philosopher named Thomas Nagel once wrote an essay asking a very simple question: what is it like to be a bat? Not what a bat does, not how a bat hunts, but what the world feels like from inside the bat, the texture of its experience, the shape of its own small awareness. He argued that if there is any what it is like at all, then there is a subject there, a candle, a tiny point of view, and if there is no what it is like, then, in a sense, there is no one home. So when you try to imagine the years before you existed, you are asking a question that has no inside. No bat, no candle, no what it is like, not darkness, not silence, not even nothing really, because nothing, when you look closely, still sounds like a thing. It is more accurate and stranger and gentler to say there was no question being asked at all. Modern medicine has given us a small keyhole into this strangeness. Consider what happens under general anesthesia. A patient goes to sleep on a surgical table. The anesthesiologist counts down, and then from the patient's side, something remarkable happens, or rather, nothing happens, but in a very particular way. It is not like a long night's sleep, where dreams stretch and morning eventually arrives. It is more like a jump cut. One moment the ceiling of the operating room, the next moment the ceiling of the recovery room. Hours have passed, but for the patient, no time passed. Not fast time, not slow time, no time. People who have experienced this often describe it with quiet awe. There was no fear, there was no black, there was no waiting, there was simply a gap that did not feel like a gap, because there was no one there to notice its length. In a way, they touched, for a few hours, the same texture that stretched behind them for almost 14 billion years. Now hold this gently. Anesthesia is not death. Anesthesia is not pre-existence. It is only a small borrowed hint at what happens when the subject is temporarily absent. Science can describe the body and the brain during those hours, what the self ultimately is, and whether some deeper thread continues beyond our instruments, remains a mystery that many traditions have thought about with great care, and that no measurement has yet closed. But even as a hint, it is a soft one. The long dark before you was not cold. It was not empty in a way you would recognize. It was simply the absence of a question, and questions, it turns out, are only asked by candles that have been lit. The body listening to this voice tonight is very new, a few decades old perhaps. Warm, breathing, weighed down against a pillow. But the atoms inside that body are ancient. Almost every one of them is older than the earth, older than the sun, older than the ground beneath every city that has ever stood. If you could trace the particles in your fingertips backward through time, you would find yourself, quite literally, walking out of stars. This is not poetry, though it sounds like it. It is chemistry. In the first minutes after the beginning of the universe, only the lightest ingredients existed. Hydrogen, a little helium, a whisper of lithium, that was all. No calcium for your bones, no iron for your blood, no carbon for the long, patient molecules that would one day fold themselves into a thinking creature. The universe, in its infancy, did not yet have the raw material to make you. Everything heavier had to be cooked, and the ovens were stars. Inside the deep pressure of stellar cores, hydrogen was pressed into helium, helium into carbon, carbon into oxygen, and slowly, over generations of stars living and dying, the heavier elements began to appear. When a large star finally reached the end of its life, it did something extraordinary. It collapsed inward, then rebounded outward in an explosion so bright it could briefly outshine an entire galaxy. And in that flash of dying, it scattered its enriched interior across the cold spaces between the stars. Some of that scattered dust drifted for hundreds of millions of years. It joined slow-moving clouds. It gathered gravity. It condensed into new stars, and around those stars, into planets. About 4.5 billion years ago, in a quiet arm of a spiral galaxy, a young star we now call the Sun formed from one of those enriched clouds, and around it, a small rocky world settled into orbit. That world would become Earth, and the very atoms that would one day become you were already there, patiently mixed into its oceans, its stones, its air. Isotope studies allow us to read this history quite literally. Certain forms of atoms carry small signatures, a specific balance of protons and neutrons that tell scientists where and when they were forged. When researchers examine the calcium in a bone or the iron in a drop of blood, they are looking at material with a history written directly into it. Some of that calcium was made in stars that died before our sun was born. Some of that iron rode the shockwave of a supernova across unimaginable distances before settling into the rock that became this planet. And here is the softest wonder to hold for a moment. Long before you were you, the raw material of you was drifting. It was inside oceans that no one swam in, inside plants that bent towards suns no one ever saw, inside animals that walked in forests that had no name. Every breath you take contains molecules that have passed through countless other lives, human and otherwise, in the long history of the planet. Every heartbeat is powered by iron that once glowed inside a dying star, which means that in a very quiet, very literal sense, the material of you was not absent during those 13.8 billion years. It was patient, it was travelling, it was being slowly gathered, slowly refined, slowly assembled into the possibility of a listener. Only the listener was missing. You were not being kept in a waiting room somewhere. You were not late. You were simply not yet, because you is what happens when this old material folds itself, for a little while, into a pattern that can wonder about itself. And that pattern, remarkable as it is, needed almost the entire age of the universe to become possible. There is a strange way to hold the age of the universe that changes how it feels. Instead of a long emptiness with you at the end, imagine a long, slow rehearsal, not one directed by anyone in particular that we cannot say, but a rehearsal in the sense that the conditions for a listener like you had to be practiced again and again until they were possible at all. Consider carbon. Almost every complex molecule in your body is built on a spine of carbon atoms. Without carbon, there is no DNA, no protein, no thought. And carbon, as we saw, is made inside stars. But the specific way stars make carbon is quietly astonishing. It relies on a very particular resonance, a kind of energetic sweet spot that allows 3 helium nuclei to fuse into carbon inside a stellar core. If that resonance were slightly different, carbon would be rare, and life as we know it would be rare with it. Some physicists have wondered aloud whether the balance is a coincidence or a hint of something deeper. That question is still open. Consider the strength of gravity, the mass of the electron, the way the strong nuclear force holds protons together. Many of these values sit in narrow ranges that allow stars to burn steadily for billions of years, planets to hold on to atmospheres, and molecules to remain stable long enough to become interesting. If any of these numbers were nudged too far in one direction, the universe might have collapsed too soon, or spread out too thin, or produced only hydrogen and never anything more. There is a great deal of debate about what to make of this. Some theoretical models propose that our universe is one of many, each with slightly different settings, and that we naturally find ourselves in one of the rare ones where observers can exist. Other thinkers suggest that we simply do not yet understand why the numbers are what they are, and that a deeper theory will one day explain them. And many people around the world, listening to this same idea, feel that it points toward a creator whose intentions are gently written into the fabric of things. Science, honestly, does not close that door. It measures the numbers. It does not answer why they are kind. Whichever interpretation feels most true to you, notice this. The universe took a very long time to arrive at conditions where a mind like yours could form. Hydrogen had to cool into atoms. Atoms had to gather into stars. Stars had to live long enough to make heavier elements. Those elements had to be scattered, gathered again, and assembled into rocky worlds. Those worlds had to hold liquid water. That water had to remain liquid for hundreds of millions of years. Simple chemistry had to find its way into simple biology. Simple biology had to become nervous systems. Nervous systems had to become brains. Brains had to become the kind that could ask, at bedtime, what it means to have been dead for 13.8 billion years. Every one of those steps could have failed. Many, on many worlds, probably did. And yet, here, the rehearsal went far enough that you appeared in it. This does not mean the universe was aiming at you personally, in the way an archer aims at a target. That is a claim science does not make, and thoughtful traditions have long treated with care. But it does mean that the conditions producing you were rare, layered, and improbable enough that your existence, however brief, is not a small event pressed against a vast unimportance. It is a small event with a very long lead-up. Perhaps that is why the number 13.8 billion, when you hold it gently, does not feel like a wall behind you. It feels more like a slow inhalation, a long, patient breath the universe took before you exhaled into being. And what you do with the exhale, this life, this night, this moment of listening, is somehow woven into the shape of all that came before. Somewhere between the ancient atoms and the adult mind, there is a threshold you crossed that no one, not even you, can quite locate. The moment when there began to be someone home, not just a body forming, not just cells dividing, but the very first faint sense of being, a candle so dim it barely counted as a light. We do not know exactly when it lit. For most of a pregnancy, the growing brain is not yet doing what we would recognize as experience. The neurons are laying down like slow roads. The connections between them are only beginning to form. In the earliest weeks and months, there is activity, but it is more like distant weather than thought. Something is happening, but there is likely no one yet asking what. Then, gradually, in the third trimester, something quietly changes. Researchers using electroencephalography, a way of listening to the faint electrical rhythms of the brain, have observed the emergence of longer, more organized patterns in the fetal brain, waves that begin to travel across regions instead of firing in isolated pockets. The brain, as some scientists describe it, starts holding conversations with itself. Whether those conversations contain any inner experience yet is one of the deepest and most humble questions in modern neuroscience. No one can measure the presence of a subject from the outside. We can only measure the presence of the conditions that seem to make a subject possible. So there is a soft mystery in the last months before your birth. A brain quietly becoming the kind of place where a self might come to live, and no bell rings, no door opens visibly. At some point, according to researchers who study consciousness, the flicker may have already begun, and no one, not the mother, not the doctors, not even the small being itself, could have said the exact moment. Then birth, the great transition, light, cold, sound with edges, air rushing into lungs that have never held it, from within the warmth of the womb, into a much larger, much stranger room. And still, in those first hours and days, there is no coherent I yet, no story of a self, only sensation, only need, only warmth and hunger, and the shapes of faces slowly becoming recognizable. For months after birth, the brain continues one of the most extraordinary construction projects in the known universe. Synapses form at a staggering rate, trillions of tiny connections, more than will ever exist again in a single human life, and then, gently, the brain begins to prune. Connections that are used grow stronger. Connections that are not fade quietly. The mind is not built by adding, it is built by choosing what to keep. Somewhere in that choosing, you appeared. Not as a switch flipping, more as a slow dawn. First the awareness of warmth versus cold, then the awareness of a face that returns, then the awareness that the face belongs to someone who is not you, then, later, the awareness that there is a you at all, a small, private point of view looking out through two eyes. Most people cannot remember any of this, and that is part of the wonder. The very process by which you became a self happened in a mind too new to record it. You were there, and you were not there, all at once. Which means the border between not existing and existing is not a wall, it is a mist a gentle, gradual thickening of experience. If you try to point to the exact instant you began, you cannot. If your parents try, they cannot either. You slipped into being the way morning slips into a room. No announcement, no first note, only the slow discovery, sometime later, that light had already been in the world for a while. And if the beginning of you is that soft, perhaps the long absence behind it was soft too. Not a hard edge, not a slammed door, only a room that was quiet, and then, very gradually, less quiet, because a small candle had finally been lit inside it. Here, at the close of this first long stretch of the night, we can gently name what has been unfolding beneath every section so far. The long dark before you was not a hardship. It could not have been, because hardship needs a nervous system, and a nervous system needs a body, and a body needs a universe old enough to make one, and until all of that was in place, there was no one for pain to reach. Consider what pain actually requires. It needs receptors in tissue that respond to damage or pressure or heat. It needs nerves to carry those signals inward. It needs a spinal cord to relay them. It needs a brain, and specifically certain regions of that brain, to weave those signals into the felt experience of hurting. And even beyond the mechanics, it needs something more elusive, a subject, a candle, a someone for whom the hurt is happening. Take any of these away, and the entire structure of suffering quietly dissolves. Now look back at the 13.8 billion years behind you. During almost all of that time, none of these ingredients existed for you. No receptors bearing your name, no nerves reporting to your future spine, no brain wired into your particular self, no subject waiting in a hallway to feel long. The universe was busy. Stars lived and died, galaxies rotated, planets cooled, but nowhere in all of that was there a small, worried version of you enduring the wait. This is a very different picture from what the fearful mind often paints. When we imagine the time before we existed, we often accidentally smuggle ourselves into it. We picture a dark room, and we picture ourselves standing in it, alone, for billions of years. That is the source of the dread, not the absence itself, but the mistaken image of our conscious selves stuck inside the absence. But there was no you in the dark. There was only the dark, and the dark, without a witness, is not even dark. It is nothing that needs a word. Some listeners will recognize the shape of an ancient thought here. Around 2,000 years ago, a philosopher named Epicurus made a very simple argument. He said that death is nothing to us, because when death is present, we are not, and when we are present, death is not. Therefore, the two never meet. We will explore that idea more slowly later. But notice for now that Epicurus was really pointing out a symmetry. If the absence after life cannot hurt us, then the absence before life cannot have hurt us either. And you have already lived through the second one. You made it through 13.8 billion years of not being. You did not flinch. You did not grow tired. You were not lonely. You were not bored. Not because you were brave, but because there was no you yet to be any of those things. The universe carried on, and your absence weighed nothing. There is something quietly healing in this thought, especially for a mind that turns and turns at night. Many of us carry, without quite realizing it, a low background hum of fear about non-existence, before birth, after death, or in the vast lonely spaces between us and the stars. But the pre-birth silence, at least, is not a theory. It is not a belief we have to take on faith. It is something we have already survived, effortlessly, and without a single wound. What waits on the other side of a life is a deeper mystery, and many traditions across the world have wondered about it with great care. Science, honestly, does not close that door. It observes the body and the brain, and beyond that, it is quiet. But even inside that quiet, the past has already given us a small, patient reassurance. If the vast absence behind you could hold your non-being so gently, then perhaps whatever comes ahead is not the terrifying void the anxious mind imagines. It may be simpler, softer, nothing that requires you to brace. You have already crossed one long silence without pain. That is the promise this night has quietly offered. And now, from that first crossing, we can begin to look more closely at how a self assembles itself out of the dark in the first place. There is a moment, though no one can point to it, when a room that had always been dark suddenly has a small light in it. Not a bright one, not a decisive one, just a soft, uncertain glow. And once that glow appears, everything about the room quietly changes, because now there is something inside it that can notice it exists. That soft glow, in a human life, is awareness, and its arrival is one of the strangest and most tender events in the natural world. In the first weeks after birth, the newborn brain is astonishingly busy, but not yet unified. Millions of neurons fire and settle. Reflexes are strong. The senses receive floods of information. But most researchers who study early consciousness are careful to say that what we would call a stable self is not yet present. There is sensation, but not yet a clear subject. Warmth is felt, but there is not yet someone thinking, "I am warm." Then, gradually, over the first months and years, something extraordinary begins. The brain builds itself in a way that seems designed, almost, to invite a self to move in. One of the most well-studied processes is synaptic pruning. In the first years of life, the brain produces far more connections between neurons than it will ever need. It is as though the mind sketches out every possible road, every possible bridge, and only later decides which ones to keep. The connections that are used repeatedly, by sights, by sounds, by touch, by the voice of a caregiver, grow stronger and remain. The ones that go unused fade quietly away. In this way, experience literally shapes the brain, road by road, into the specific mind that will become you. At the same time, a network of regions that neuroscientists have named the default mode network begins to mature. It is a set of brain areas that quietly hum together when a person is not focused on any particular task, when the mind wanders, imagines, remembers, or thinks about itself. In infants, this network is faint and disorganized. As the years pass, it strengthens. It weaves together memory and imagination and self-reflection, and many researchers suspect that its slow ripening is closely tied to the growing sense of being someone, a small, private center around which experiences begin to gather. But notice how gentle this ignition is. There is no first thought that a baby remembers. There is no exact instant when awareness switches on. If you asked yourself right now, when you first became you, you would not be able to answer. The earliest memories most people carry begin around age 3 or 4, and even those are patchy, more like faded photographs than continuous film. The years before that are not empty. They are lived, deeply and vividly, by the small person you were becoming. They simply were not recorded in a way the older mind can retrieve. Think about what this quietly means. The very process by which you became a self was invisible to you, even as it was happening. You did not witness your own arrival. You did not attend your own beginning. Somewhere between the first breath and the first stable memory, a candle was gently placed inside a room that had always been dark, and by the time you were old enough to look around and say, "Here I am," the candle had already been burning for years. There is a particular tenderness in this. It suggests that the arrival of a self is not a dramatic event with fireworks and a clear line. It is a slow accumulation. It is the room learning, night after night, that it holds a light now. It is the network of connections becoming stable enough to sustain the pattern we call me. Some scientists have wondered whether consciousness might actually be a kind of ongoing weaving, not a thing that turns on once, but a process that has to be produced, moment by moment, by the brain's cooperation with itself. In that view, you are not so much a fixed object that was born, but a continuous happening, a gentle relighting of the candle each morning as sleep releases its grip and the network of self quietly reassembles. If that is even partly true, it means the boundary between existence and non-existence is not a wall you crossed once, long ago. It is a soft membrane you cross gently every night, when sleep dissolves the sense of you, and every morning, when you are quietly rebuilt. The first ignition of awareness, back in infancy, may have been the first time it happened in this body, but it is happening still, at a slower rhythm, each time you wake up, which means the vast dark before your birth was not a distant foreign country. It was, in a small way, the same territory you visit every night when you sleep deeply enough to lose yourself. You have been walking in and out of the painless dark all along, and only in the daylight do you forget how gently the door opens. There is a strange coastline in your mind that you have never seen. It stretches for years, and you were there for every mile of it, and yet when you try to walk back to it, the map goes blank. This is the coastline of your earliest childhood, the long stretch of life before your memories begin. Most adults can remember something from around age 3 or 4. A birthday cake, a room with a certain colour of wallpaper, the face of a grandparent leaning close. But before that, the first steps, the first words, the thousands of days when the world was being learnt for the very first time, almost nothing remains. The events happened, photographs prove it, parents remember, only the person who lived them does not. Scientists call this infantile amnesia, and it has puzzled researchers for more than a century. The lost years are not lost because nothing important happened. In fact, more is learned in the first 3 years of life than perhaps in any period afterward. Language, faces, physical coordination, the entire architecture of the self begins there, and yet most of it is stored somewhere that the older mind cannot re-enter. Part of the answer seems to lie in the hippocampus, a small seahorse-shaped structure tucked deep in the brain that plays a central role in forming long-term autobiographical memories, the kind that can be retrieved later in a coherent way with the sense of "I was there." In infants and toddlers, the hippocampus is still maturing, its connections are still being laid down, new neurons are being generated rapidly, and this constant remodeling may actually make it difficult for stable, retrievable memories to form. Research on adult neurogenesis has suggested that even later in life, the birth of new neurons in this region may quietly reshape the pathways where older memories are stored, softening them, blurring them, sometimes erasing them altogether. There is also the matter of language. Autobiographical memory in adults leans heavily on words, on the ability to encode an event in a sentence, to give it a name, a time, a place. Before language is mature, experiences are lived vividly, but they are lived in a wordless mode. They are felt as texture, sound, warmth, the shape of a room, the emotion of a face, not as narrative. And when the older, word-shaped mind reaches back for those wordless experiences, it often finds them slipping through its fingers because it does not yet know the language they were spoken in. So there is a whole country inside you that you cannot revisit, a country where you were alive and awake and learning, but where the version of you who lived there did not yet know how to write things down. Now sit gently with this. What was it like to be that small person? Was it dark for you? Was it lonely? Almost certainly not. Small children are, by every measure we have, deeply immersed in the world. They are curious. They are attached. They laugh, cry, sleep, dream. Their days are extraordinarily rich. It is only the retrieval that is missing later. The lived moments were full. The doorway back to them has simply been quietly closed. And here is where a soft door opens between this idea and the one at the heart of tonight. If you can lose years of your own lived life and still be here, whole, unhurt, and able to listen to a voice in the dark, then the mind's fear of the unremembered may be gentler than it seems. You already carry, inside you, a vast stretch of unrememberable existence, years when you were alive but not able to store the story. And notice, sitting here now, that those years do not haunt you. They are not experienced as loss, they are simply the ground you grew from. In a very small, careful way, this suggests that the vast, unrememberable stretch behind your birth is not so different in flavour. If you cannot remember being 3, and it does not hurt, then the deeper reason you cannot remember being minus 1,000 years old is not more painful. It is only more thorough, the same softness, extended. Some researchers have wondered whether the mind, in some form, is doing the same thing at every scale, choosing which experiences to keep, gently letting the rest go. The years before memory, the moments before sleep, the vast time before birth. In each case, life continues without the ability to retrieve everything that has passed through it. And still, the person keeps walking. Still, the candle keeps burning. So the missing coastline of your childhood is more than a curiosity. It is a small daily proof that you have always been able to live inside forgetting without being harmed by it. The years you cannot recall did not become a wound, they became the quiet ground of everything you are, which means the deeper darkness behind you, the pre-birth long dark, is not a foreign territory. It is only the same forgetting, taken further back, into a place where there was not even a small hippocampus yet trying to store the day. There is a beautiful and slightly unsettling question that philosophers have handled with great care for centuries. It goes something like this. Are you the same person who woke up this morning? Not similar, not related, but actually the same. The exact same self, unbroken, continuous, one. Almost every part of you assumes the answer is yes. That is why you plan for tomorrow. That is why you feel responsible for what you said yesterday. That is why, when you look at old photographs of yourself as a child, you say, that was me, even though almost nothing about that small body remains physically present in the adult standing in front of the mirror. And yet, when you look closely at the way the mind actually works, the sense of a single unbroken self begins to feel more like a gentle story than a solid fact. A philosopher named Derek Parfit spent much of his life turning this question over. He asked strange, careful thought experiments. Imagine, he said, that a machine could scan your entire body and mind, atom by atom, and rebuild an exact copy of you somewhere else, while the original is quietly ended. Would the copy be you? It would remember everything you remember. It would love everything you love. Its inner life would feel continuous. And yet, from the outside, something has clearly changed. Parfit's careful answer, after many years, was surprising. He came to feel that what matters most is not some hidden essence of identity, but the pattern of psychological continuity, the memories, the intentions, the personality that carries forward. In some sense, he suggested, you already are that pattern, and identity is a softer, more permeable thing than we usually assume. Then there is the work of Michael Gazzaniga and other researchers who studied patients whose brains had been divided. In certain severe cases of epilepsy, doctors used to cut the thick band of nerve fibers that connects the brain's two hemispheres. The surgery helped with seizures, but it also produced patients whose two hemispheres could no longer share information directly. And in careful experiments, something remarkable emerged. The left hemisphere, which usually handles language, would confidently explain the person's behavior, even when the behavior had actually been driven by the right hemisphere, which the left could not see. The left brain, in other words, was making up plausible stories about actions it had not initiated. Not to lie, but because the mind, faced with a gap in information, gently invents a narrative to keep the sense of a single self intact. Gazzaniga has often described this as the brain's interpreter, a quiet, tireless process that stitches the pieces of experience into a coherent story, not because there is a fixed self at the center, but because coherence is useful. It lets you plan, remember, love, and function. It gives the day a main character. Sit with this for a moment. Every morning your brain wakes up and quietly gathers together sensations, memories, moods, and body states. It weaves them into a single seamless experience and hands it to you as I. You do not notice the weaving, you only notice the finished cloth, and you rest, day after day, inside that cloth, sure that the person wearing it is exactly the person who wore it yesterday. But cells are replaced. Neurons update their connections. Memories are quietly re-encoded each time they are recalled, subtly changed, softened, sharpened, retold. The physical stuff of you is not the same as it was even a few years ago. And still, the story holds. The character remains recognizable. The book does not lose its plot. Some contemplative traditions in the East have noticed this for a very long time. Buddhist thinkers in particular have spoken about the self as a river rather than a stone. The river is real. It has a shape, a name, a direction, but its water is always different water. If you tried to point to the river as a solid thing, you would come away holding only wetness in your hands, and yet no one would say the river is nothing. If your sense of being a single, continuous self is more like a river than a stone, then the boundary between existing and not existing may also be softer than the anxious mind fears. Existence, in this view, is not a fixed thing that begins with a bang, holds steady for a lifetime, and then blinks out. It is a pattern that keeps being woven, moment by moment, until eventually the loom stops. What that means for the deeper nature of the self, science does not claim to know. Many traditions have offered their own tender answers, and those answers deserve respect. But even from within the science, one small comfort emerges. If the continuous you of your daily life is already a gentle illusion, a story stitched fresh each morning, then the vast time before that story began was not the loss of anyone real. It was simply a stretch when the weaving had not yet started. And when you consider that the same weaving pauses, softly, every night in deep sleep, the long dark before birth begins to feel less like a foreign country and more like the same familiar quiet you have always been visiting between chapters of the story you call yourself. There is something you do almost every night that mirrors, in miniature, the vast pre-birth silence, and you have been doing it since you were very small. You lie down, you close your eyes, you drift, and after a while, at a certain depth of sleep, something remarkable happens. The you that has been living the day quietly steps aside, not into dreams, not into a story, into a stretch where, for a while, there is no story at all. Deep non-REM sleep, the kind that comes in the first few hours of the night, is one of the most extraordinary states in the natural world. In this stage, the brain's electrical activity slows into long sweeping waves. Consciousness, as we usually understand it, becomes very faint. If someone were to wake you during this phase, you would not report a rich dream. You would often not report anything at all. Just a gentle sense that time has passed and you were not there for it. Neuroscientists studying this stage have looked closely at the thalamus, a small structure near the center of the brain that acts in a way like a gate for incoming information. In wakefulness, the thalamus allows a rich stream of signals to flow into the cortex, where they are woven into experience. In deep non-REM sleep, that gate quietly narrows. The cortex still hums with slow rhythms, and important housekeeping continues. Memories are consolidated, waste is cleared, the body is repaired, but the constant flow of moment-to-moment awareness thins to almost nothing. The candle of the self dims. The room is still there. The body is still there, but the small point of view that usually sits inside them has for a while gone quiet. Now think about what this means. Every night, without any drama, you enter a state where the sense of being you softens, sometimes almost to the point of vanishing, and every morning you emerge from it without the slightest sense of having suffered. You do not remember those hours as long. You do not remember them as short. You do not remember them at all, because there was no continuous witness there to remember them. If someone described this experience to you cold, that you routinely lose your sense of self for hours at a time, and that no one, not even you, notices from the inside, it might sound alarming, but it is not alarming. It is deeply ordinary. You have done it thousands of times. You have almost certainly done it recently, and you are here now, whole, listening to a voice, none the worse for it. There is a soft echo in this that is worth listening to. The vast time before your birth, the 13.8 billion years we spoke of earlier, was not, from the inside, a long endurance test. It was more like a very deep, very long stretch of the same kind of non-experience you visit every night. There was no candle, there was no thalamic gate opening for you, there was no room where you waited, bored or lonely, for time to pass. There was simply an absence of a subject, exactly like the absence that quietly settles over your bedroom for a few hours each night when the sleeping mind releases the day. Researchers who study sleep have gently pointed out something else that matters here. Deep sleep is not a shutdown. It is an active state, carefully orchestrated by the brain, with its own rhythms and purposes. The mind does not vanish, it is doing things. Memories are being sorted, emotions are being softened, the body is being tended. What is missing is only the continuous I that usually rides on top of all of it, narrating, which means the loss of self in sleep is not a loss of life. It is more like a temporary lowering of the narrator. The story pauses, the world continues. If you have ever lain awake at night worrying about the idea of non-existence, before birth, after death, in the still hours between, It can be quietly reassuring to notice how often you already enter something like it, and how gently you return. The mind that turns and turns in the dark, imagining nothingness as unbearable, is often forgetting that it lives inside a body that walks calmly into the same softness every night without protest. Some contemplative traditions have long treated sleep as a kind of teacher for exactly this reason. Not because sleep is a metaphor for death, in any final sense, many traditions hold, respectfully, that what waits at the deeper edge is beyond our instruments and our stories, but because sleep is a small, safe rehearsal of releasing the self, a nightly reminder that the pattern we call me can loosen its grip, dissolve into slow waves, and then reform again in the morning, without anything terrible happening in the interval. So when you next lie down and feel yourself drifting, notice how quietly it happens. There is no fear at the threshold. There is no bright edge. There is only a softening, and then a stretch where you are not there to witness anything, and then quite naturally, the coming back. In that small pattern is a very old, very tender lesson about the shape of the long dark on either side of a life, and how gently the mind, when it stops resisting, has always known how to walk into it. There is a particular kind of quiet that a small number of people alive today have touched, not through meditation, not through sleep, but through the strange borrowed threshold of general anesthesia, and their reports, though careful and imperfect, offer one of the closest keyholes we have into what deep, subjectless time might feel like from the inside, or rather, might not feel like. Modern anesthesia is a remarkable and delicate art. A drug like propofol, administered by an anesthesiologist with great precision, gently interrupts the brain's ability to maintain the integrated, unified experience we call consciousness. The person is not sleeping. The brain state is very different from ordinary sleep. Rather, certain patterns of communication between brain regions quiet down, and the seamless weaving of experience temporarily stops. What remains is a body, cared for, monitored, breathing under careful hands. What pauses is the eye that usually looks out through the eyes. Researchers who study anesthesia have observed something striking. When the drugs take effect, the brain does not simply switch off. It shifts into a very different mode of activity. Some measurements suggest that the long-distance conversations between parts of the cortex, the ones that seem important for a unified sense of experience, become disrupted or reduced. The parts still hum, but they no longer speak as clearly to one another. Whatever the exact mechanism, the person, from the outside, is deeply unaware, and from the inside, most patients report something remarkable and gently the same. They report nothing. Not darkness, not silence, not stillness, not "it felt like a moment," simply a gap in the story where no story existed, a jump cut between counting backward and hearing a nurse say their name. Hours may have passed, delicate surgeries may have taken place, conversations, movements, monitoring, and for the person inside the body, there is no experience of any of it. The clock outside changed. The clock inside did not exist. People who have gone through this often describe, when asked, a certain quiet awe. Some say it was completely different from sleep, which usually has some faint residue, a dream, a sense of duration, a vague trace of having been somewhere. Anesthesia, they say, left no residue at all. It was not that they slept deeply, it was that, for a while, from their own point of view, they were not there. Now, we should walk gently here, because it is easy, in the wonder of this idea, to leap into strong claims. Some voices might say, so that is what death is, so that is what non-existence feels like. But that is more than the evidence can carry. Anesthesia is a controlled, temporary state produced by a body that is still alive, still monitored, still functioning at the cellular level. It is not death. It is not pre-existence. It is not a window into any final truth about what happens to the self at the edge of life. It is a small borrowed hint, a keyhole, not a doorway. Many traditions across the world hold, with great care, that the deeper nature of the self, what a person truly is, and what may or may not continue when the body no longer sustains it, is a question science's instruments do not reach. Anesthesia measures the brain. It cannot measure whether a soul, if such a thing exists, was ever tied to the machinery in the first place. Whatever your intuitions or beliefs about that deeper question, they are not challenged by what happens inside an operating room. The instruments only see the body's side of the mystery. But even inside that humility, the keyhole is meaningful, because it demonstrates, gently and repeatedly, that the sense of being a continuous subject is not fixed. It can be paused, it can be interrupted, and when it is interrupted, the person on the other side does not describe suffering. They do not describe fear. They do not describe long, dragging time. They describe absence, and they describe it without alarm, which brings us back to the long dark before your birth. For 13.8 billion years, no anesthesiologist was needed. There were no drugs, no operating rooms, no careful hands, simply the natural absence of a subject, the vast unfolding of the universe, with no small you to feel it as long. If the shape of that absence resembles anything at all in modern human experience, it may resemble, faintly, the jump-cut quiet of anesthesia, hours passing on the outside, and no interior at all. And notice what happens to the mind when it takes this in. The imagined horror of non-existence begins to loosen, because non-existence, in every soft evidence we can gather, is not an experience. It is not a state to endure, it is the absence of anyone to endure anything. The candle was not sitting in the dark for billions of years, waiting to be lit. The candle simply had not yet been placed in the room, and when at last it was, gently, in a hospital or a home somewhere on this small blue world, there was no memory of any waiting, because there had not been any waiting to remember. There is a very old thought, quiet and clean, that has consoled many minds across many centuries. It was written down more than 2,000 years ago in a small Roman poem by a poet named Lucretius, who was echoing his teacher Epicurus, and the thought is beautifully simple. It goes something like this: look back at the vast time before you were born. That, Lucretius wrote, is a mirror of the vast time after you will die, and no one weeps at the first. So why weep at the second? He called this the mirror argument, and he offered it not as a proof, but as a gentle correction, a small nudge to the mind that fears one darkness while completely ignoring the other, equally long, equally deep, that lies quietly behind us. His observation was this: if the absence before your birth was not painful, then, in strict fairness, the absence after your death cannot be painful either. They are the same fabric, only your position in time has changed. The stuff of them is identical. For a long time this argument slept quietly in old libraries, but philosophers, including Derek Parfit in the 20th century, returned to it and turned it slowly in their hands. They pointed out a small psychological asymmetry that Lucretius had not fully addressed. Human minds tend to care more about the future than the past. We fear pain that lies ahead more than pain that lies behind. This is not a flaw. It is likely built into us by evolution, because there is little we can do about yesterday and much we can do about tomorrow. So we tilt forward, and when we consider our own non-existence, we naturally tilt toward the one that lies ahead of us and away from the one that lies behind. But notice something important. That tilt is about our attention, not about the nature of the two darknesses themselves. The two darknesses, viewed from the outside, are equally silent, equally subjectless, equally free of suffering. The mind may worry about them unevenly, but they, in themselves, are the same. And here is the soft closing of a promise this night has been unfolding. If the vast pre-birth silence did not hurt you, and it did not, because there was no you for it to reach, then the pattern of that silence has already been survived. It has already been walked through, not by a brave version of you gritting your teeth in the dark, but by the simple fact that there was no you needed. The absence carried itself. This does not mean death is nothing to us in every possible sense. Many traditions, many thoughtful people, and many quiet voices in every culture have suggested that the deeper nature of a life may not end where the body ends. That door remains, as it has always been, open. Science's instruments observe the brain and the body. They do not measure the soul. They do not claim to know whether some suppler continuity exists beyond their reach. That mystery is one of the oldest human intuitions, and it deserves to be held with tenderness. But even inside that openness, the mirror argument offers a small, real comfort. Because whatever else may or may not follow, there is at least one part of the fear that can be gently set down, the fear of non-existence as a felt experience. That fear, when examined, is looking at something that has already happened on a truly vast scale and left no wound. The mind is treating the pre-birth silence as if it were fine, and the post-life silence as if it were terrifying, when in the pure shape of the two, they are the same thing seen from opposite ends of a small bright interval. Some listeners tonight may find in this thought a purely secular consolation, a way of holding the finitude of life without dread. Others may hold it alongside deeper hopes about what lies beyond the reach of our instruments. Both are welcome here. The point is not to decide the deepest question. The point is to notice that at least one layer of the fear is quieter than it seemed. You have already lived through the long silence once. Its texture is known, and by every soft measure available to us, it was not cruel. You may notice, sitting in this quiet room tonight, that the mind can loosen its grip a little around this idea. Not solve, not resolve, just loosen. And that loosening is what the mirror was always for. Lucretius did not want to strip away wonder. He wanted to strip away the specific kind of dread that comes from imagining ourselves inside an absence that never contained us. If you carry only one small thought forward from these first 3 long stretches of the night, let it be this. The universe was very old before you arrived. It was patient. It was quiet. It was not lonely, because loneliness needs someone. It made room for you slowly, atom by atom, star by star, thought by thought. And it will hold that same softness around you again, whenever the small candle of this life eventually dims. What happens beyond that dimming is a question wiser than any of us alone. But the dark itself, the raw texture of it, has already touched you, and you did not know, and you were not hurt. The rest of the night, from here, is simply a widening of that first small comfort. There is a small trick the mind plays on itself, so quietly that most people never catch it doing so. When we hear the phrase 13.8 billion years, we imagine a very long line, stretching back into the dark, with the universe walking slowly along it, tick by tick, waiting for us to arrive. But what if there was no line? What if the long only became long once someone was here to feel it? This is the strange terrain that some physicists have quietly wandered into. An Italian physicist named Carlo Rovelli, along with a number of colleagues in the field of what is sometimes called relational physics, has spent much of his career gently questioning our common picture of time. In the usual picture, time is a background, a kind of invisible river flowing in one direction, carrying everything along with it. There is a past, a present, and a future, and they exist independently of anything happening inside them. The river flows whether or not anyone is looking. But when physicists look closely at the equations that describe the universe at its deepest levels, this picture becomes harder to hold. In some formulations, time as an independent thing quietly disappears. What remains is change, the way one thing relates to another, the way heat spreads, the way particles interact. In this view, time is not the stage on which events happen. Time is more like the pattern of the events themselves. Take away the events, and there is no stage left underneath. Rovelli has often used a helpful image. Think of a room with a candle in it. You could say the candle is burning through time, or you could say something subtler, that what we call time in that room is the melting of the wax, the flicker of the flame, the slow warming of the air. Without any of those changes, without any interactions, there would be no time in the room in any meaningful sense. It would not still be flowing invisibly. It would simply not be relevant. There is another layer to this idea that comes from thermodynamics. Some physicists, including Rovelli, have suggested that the felt direction of time, the way we sense yesterday behind us and tomorrow ahead, arises from the way heat and disorder spread. In a universe where things become gently more mixed over time, minds evolve inside that unfolding and naturally feel the mixing as a direction. Past is where things were more ordered. Future is where they will be more scattered. Our sense of before and after may not be a fundamental feature of the cosmos. It may be a beautifully consistent side effect of living inside a universe that is slowly warming its way towards stillness. Sit gently with what this could mean for tonight's question. If time, in this view, is a relationship rather than a river, then the 13.8 billion years that preceded you was not a long empty corridor with your name at the end. It was a pattern of interactions, stars igniting, atoms bonding, galaxies drifting, with no separate clock ticking behind them. And crucially, there was no felt duration attached to those interactions, because feeling requires a mind, and minds are themselves patterns woven from the same interactions. Duration, as an experience, needs an experiencer, which means the number 13.8 billion, though real as a measurement, is not the same as a lived length. It is a description of how many patterns had to unfold before this particular pattern, the one you now recognize as yourself, could form. From inside those patterns, there was no waiting. There were only the patterns doing what they did, without anyone bored inside them. We should be careful here, of course. This is one line of physics, and there are others. Some physicists disagree strongly with Rovelli's approach. Some traditions of thought hold that time is more fundamental than his picture allows. The question of what time truly is, at its deepest level, remains one of the great open puzzles of modern science. It is a question that has invited scientific models, and, alongside them, philosophical and spiritual reflections from many traditions, each in its own careful voice. But even as a possibility, the relational view offers a small comfort. It softens the picture of the long dark before your birth. Instead of a vast cold interval where nothing happened for an unbearable stretch, it offers something gentler, an unfolding of patterns, no one of them long, no one of them dragging, because there was no clock separate from the patterns themselves. The long only appeared once you did. Once a brain had grown complex enough to hold the memory of one moment against another, once a mind could compare before and after, and feel the space between them, then a small local clock began to tick inside a human skull, and it is that inner clock, yours, the one keeping track of the day you had, the years you have lived, that turns the ancient patterns of the universe into a number that can feel large. So when the mind, at night, tries to imagine you enduring 13.8 billion years of not being here, it is making a very human mistake. It is assuming its own clock existed even when there was no one to carry it. In truth, the clock only started when you did, and it stops, in some sense, whenever you do too. There is a very old idea in physics that says the universe is not just changing, but changing in a particular direction. The idea is called the second law of thermodynamics, and though its name is a mouthful, its heart is simple. Things tend to become more mixed, more spread out, more disordered as time goes on. A hot cup of tea cools, a tidy room becomes messy, a star, over billions of years, uses up its fuel. On the larger scales, the universe is gently drifting toward an ever more even, ever less structured state. Physicists call this drift entropy, and they often say that entropy has a slow hand, patient, unhurried, but relentless. And yet, remarkably, inside this general drift, small pockets of intense order can form. A snowflake, a tree, a brain, a listener lying in the dark, wondering about time. Each of these is a temporary victory of pattern against the great softening. Each is a small candle of unlikely structure, holding its shape for a while against a universe that is quietly loosening in every direction. To feel the strangeness of this, we have to go back to the beginning. As best we can tell, the very early universe was in an extraordinarily low entropy state. That means it was very ordered, very smooth, very uniform. Some physicists have called this the past hypothesis, the strange fact that the universe started out much more orderly than it needed to be, and has been slowly mixing ever since. Why it began that way is one of the deepest open questions in cosmology. Some proposals suggest deeper laws we do not yet understand. Others explore models involving many universes. Some thoughtful people hold that this improbable beginning is precisely the kind of thing that invites reflection about origin and intention. Science, honestly, does not close that door either. It notes the low entropy starting point. It does not claim to fully explain why. From that quiet, ordered beginning, entropy has been gently rising ever since. Galaxies formed and turned, stars ignited and, over eons, will exhaust their fuel. Planets warmed and cooled, and in the middle of this vast unfolding, on a small rocky world, a curious thing happened. Certain patches of matter began to organize themselves, not against the second law, exactly, because the total disorder around them was still increasing, but locally, temporarily, they built pockets of impressive order: cells, bodies, ecosystems, minds. You are, in a very real sense, one of those pockets, a brief high-order structure in the middle of a slowly softening universe. Your body maintains an internal temperature. Your cells arrange proteins with astonishing precision. Your brain sustains delicate patterns of activity that we call thought. All of this is expensive in a thermodynamic sense. To keep yourself gathered, you must constantly take in energy, food, warmth, air, and release heat and waste back into the surroundings. Every bite of dinner and every warm breath into the night air is part of a very small, very personal bargain with entropy. A 19th century physicist named Ludwig Boltzmann was one of the first to think deeply about this bargain. He was a gentle, introspective man who spent long nights turning over the mystery of why the universe seems to move in one direction rather than another. He wondered aloud whether the low entropy state of the early universe might be a kind of enormous, improbable fluctuation, a rare pocket of order in a much larger, mostly disordered reality. His idea has been refined, questioned, and reshaped many times, and modern cosmologists debate exactly how to interpret it, but the flavor of his wondering remains alive. He was asking at heart why there is any order at all, and how deep pockets of order like a human mind fit into the great slow softening. Consider what this means for tonight's slow question. You are here because entropy, on the large scale, has not yet finished its work, because there was still enough order left for stars to burn, and planets to cool, and molecules to fold into life, because, in this small corner of a large universe, there was enough energetic difference between hot suns and cold space to allow living things to weave themselves into being. You are a candle, but you are a candle inside a room that is slowly warming into evenness, and the very fact that you can burn, that a brief flare of order can maintain itself long enough to know that it exists, is one of the most improbable and tender features of the cosmos. Now come back gently to the long dark before your birth. From this perspective, that long dark was not empty. It was the slow, patient rise of entropy, punctuated by the countless small local victories that made your existence possible. Every star that lived and died was, in a sense, buying more order for the future, sending heavier elements into the dark, seeding new worlds, making the ingredients for later fires like the one that is you. And it did all of this without you needing to hold the pattern together yourself. The universe, for billions of years, was quietly arranging the raw materials of order without asking you to help. You did not have to keep your body warm during the age of the dinosaurs. You did not have to guard your cells against decay during the formation of the sun. You did not have to burn any calories at all. All of that entropy work was done, patiently, by other patterns, some of them stars, some of them ancestors, some of them the impersonal, gentle laws of physics. And when at last enough order had accumulated locally to make you possible, the candle was quietly lit, and you began to burn your own small fire, briefly, inside the great softening. So when the mind thinks about not existing for 13.8 billion years, it can help to remember that not existing did not require any effort from you. Entropy was rising, order was being spent and rebuilt, and your particular flame had not yet been struck. That is all. There was no you struggling in the wind. There was only a universe patiently preparing the room in which, one day, a candle like yours could be placed. There is a strange, almost embarrassing observation that any listener alive tonight can make. It is this. You are, obviously, in a universe capable of producing you. If the universe had not been capable of producing you, you would not be here to notice. And yet, once you actually pause and hold this small truth, it starts to feel less obvious, and stranger, and gently important. Physicists sometimes call this the anthropic principle, though the word is heavier than the idea. In its softest form, it is simply this. Any observer must find themselves in conditions that allow observers to exist. You will never wake up in a universe where the laws of physics do not permit thinkers. not because such universes are impossible to imagine, but because, if they existed, there would be no you to imagine them. It sounds almost like a joke at first. Of course a fish finds itself in water. Of course a bird finds itself in air. Of course a mind finds itself in a universe that permits minds. But the deeper you sit with it, the more it becomes a whisper rather than a joke. Because when scientists began exploring what our universe's fundamental settings had to be in order for stars to form, for chemistry to hold together, for planets to be stable, for life to have a chance, the numbers turned out to be surprisingly delicate. If gravity had been slightly stronger, the universe might have collapsed back on itself long before stars could shine. If it had been slightly weaker, matter might have spread out too thin for galaxies to form. If the strong nuclear force were tuned differently, the elements needed for chemistry could be absent. If certain other numbers were shifted, atoms could not hold electrons the way they do. In many of these cases, the range that permits complex structure appears to be quite narrow, not infinitesimally narrow in every case, but narrower than one might expect from pure randomness. This has led different thinkers in different directions. Some physicists have proposed that our universe might be one of many, a member of an unimaginably large collection of universes, each with slightly different fundamental settings. In such a multiverse, most of these universes would be sterile, incapable of forming stars or life. A few, by simple statistics, would have settings compatible with observers, and observers, by definition, would find themselves in the few. In this view, our finely tuned home is not surprising. It is just the address of the ones who exist to have addresses. Other thoughtful voices have suggested that there is a deeper law we do not yet understand, one that would show why the numbers have to be more or less what they are. From this perspective, what looks like fine-tuning might turn out to be less freedom than we think. And many people around the world, hearing the same observations, feel gently drawn toward another interpretation, that a universe so precisely capable of hosting minds may reflect an intention older than any equation we have. Science, honestly, does not disprove this reading. It measures. It does not decide who or what, if anything, set the dials. That question sits on the far side of the instruments, in the same tender place where the deepest questions of every tradition have long lived. What we can say is that the anthropic whisper is not a claim about the universe existing for you personally. It is a gentler observation. It says only that if there is a universe in which minds can appear, then that is the universe minds will find themselves in. It is a filter of self-selection, not a target of intention. What lies behind the filter? Chance, necessity, a subtle purpose we do not yet have words for, is not something the whisper alone can tell us. But even as a whisper, it changes something about how the long dark behind you feels. Because from within the anthropic view, the vast pre-birth silence was not a strange delay. It was the quiet running of the very conditions that eventually allowed a mind to appear at all. Every galaxy that formed, every star that lived and died, every molecule that folded and unfolded, was part of the improbable filtering that let a listener emerge on the other side. The long dark was not empty of relevance, it was the fine sifting through which observers could eventually be found. And when the fear at the edge of sleep whispers, "You were absent for a long time," the anthropic whisper answers, softly, that this absence was not a wasted stretch. It was the sifting itself. Without the vast quiet before you, the conditions that made you possible could not have been arranged. In a sense, the long dark was the shape of everything having to be careful enough, patient enough, ordered enough, for a candle like yours to appear at all. Whether that carefulness came from many universes, from deeper laws, or from something older than physics, is not for tonight to decide. Different listeners will hold that question differently. What we can share, together, is a small quiet reassurance. However the tuning happened, and you are, at this moment, one of the small warm rooms it eventually made possible. There is a place, deep beneath the ordinary picture of the world, where the neat rules of everyday life seem to loosen. Physicists sometimes call it the quantum realm, though the word is only a label for a very different way things behave. At this level, particles do not always sit still with well-defined properties. Instead, they exist in patterns of possibility, a range of what might happen, softly overlapping until something interacts with them, and, in some way, one outcome becomes more definite than the others. This picture has been tested in laboratories for over a century, and it has passed test after test with astonishing precision. But when physicists try to interpret what it truly means, the picture becomes gently controversial, because in the standard mathematics of quantum theory, the equations do not seem to tell you which possibility becomes real. They only tell you the probabilities, and the question of what happens to the other possibilities, the ones that did not seem to occur, is one of the most beautiful and unresolved puzzles in modern physics. In the mid-20th century, a young physicist named Hugh Everett proposed a striking interpretation. What if none of the possibilities actually disappear? What if every possible outcome quietly plays out, each in its own branch of reality, so that all the different ways the world could have gone are, in some sense, still going? This idea is now often called the many worlds interpretation. In it, every moment of quantum measurement gently splits the fabric of reality into many gently diverging paths, each internally consistent, each unaware of the others. If this interpretation were true, and it is only one interpretation among several, it would have a strange implication for tonight's question. It would mean that in some of those diverging branches, choices went differently, meetings went differently, small physical events went differently. In some, perhaps, the specific chain that led to your body's existence never quite clicked into place. In others, perhaps, similar chains clicked in slightly different rooms, on slightly different nights, forming beings who share some pattern with you but not quite all of it. Now, we must walk very softly here, because this is speculation, not established fact. The many worlds interpretation is one careful reading of the mathematics of quantum theory, held by some serious physicists and questioned by others. It is not a settled description of reality. There is no experiment that has directly confirmed the existence of other branches, and by the very structure of the theory, we cannot expect to encounter them directly. Even more importantly, the everyday language of other yous in parallel worlds is a metaphor that runs far ahead of what the mathematics actually says. The equations do not describe copies of you living secret alternative lives. They describe patterns of possibility that, on one reading, do not collapse into a single outcome. Whether that reading is right, and how to think about identity across such branches, is genuinely uncertain. There is no evidence that any other version of you actually exists as a real, separate person. Some physicists find the many worlds idea beautiful, others find it unnecessary. Many are honestly not sure. There is also a deeper reason to walk softly. The question of what a self ultimately is, whether it is only a pattern of matter, or something more that our instruments do not detect, is one that has been considered with great care by many traditions long before quantum theory arrived. To read many worlds as if it settled that question in one direction or another would be to claim more than the physics can carry. Science observes the mathematics of matter. It does not claim to describe what, if anything, holds a self together at its deepest level. That door remains open. But even as a gentle thought experiment, the idea has a soft use for tonight. It reminds us of something we may already sense without physics, that the specific you now listening is one particular arrangement among many that could have been. Different parents, different city, different night, different body perhaps. And yet, of all the arrangements that could have been, this one is the one lit at the moment. This one is the candle presently placed inside a warm room, hearing a voice in the dark. That is a strange, quiet privilege, not a boast, not a claim of importance over the others, only a soft recognition that among the many possible unfoldings the universe might have taken, one particular unfolding ended in you, here, now, alive, resting, wondering. Physicists like David Deutsch and others have written thoughtfully about how to reason inside such interpretations. They tend to emphasize humility. The mathematics is beautiful, the interpretations are debated, the metaphysical implications are open. What is not open is that from your position inside this branch, whichever it may be, the world you actually inhabit is the one that matters for how you live. The other branches, if they exist at all, cannot be visited, cannot be argued with, cannot be gathered up. Only this room can be gathered up. Only this breath can be gathered up. So when the mind entertains the thought of many possible yous, it can hold it as a wondering rather than a worry. There is no need to be envious of the possible versions who took different paths, and no need to grieve the possible versions who were never quite formed. From inside your own soft candlelight, all of them are gentle rumours from a physics too deep to walk into. This one, this life, this listening, is the one to which you belong. And it turns out that belonging to any life at all, out of the enormous space of possibilities, is a very old, very quiet kind of grace. Look, for a moment, at where you are. Not the room, not the city, not even the country. Try, gently, to place yourself on a much larger map. You are on a planet, roughly 8,000 miles across, orbiting a middle-aged yellow star. That star is one of several hundred billion in a galaxy shaped like a slow, glowing pinwheel. That galaxy sits inside a small local group of galaxies, which sits inside a larger cluster, which sits inside a vast web of galaxy filaments and quiet cosmic voids that astronomers, mapping them with great patience, sometimes call the cosmic web. You are, right now, at a very particular set of coordinates inside that web, a specific point in space, a specific instant in time, and on any reasonable measurement, the odds of finding yourself exactly here and exactly now are quietly astonishing. Consider what had to align. Our galaxy had to form from an early cloud of gas and dark matter, gathering slowly over billions of years. Our sun had to condense inside a particular arm of that galaxy, not too close to the crowded radiation-heavy center, and not too far out in its quiet fringe. Earth had to form at just the right distance from the sun to hold liquid water on its surface for immense stretches of time. Other worlds in the neighborhood, Jupiter's mass, the moon's steadying pull, had to shape the planetary environment in ways that many astronomers now suspect matter for long-term stability. Life had to arise, survive multiple mass extinctions, evolve nervous systems, and eventually give rise to a species curious enough to name the stars. And even after all of that, you personally required a further, more intimate chain of coincidences. 2 lineages of ancestors, stretching back through countless generations, had to meet at just the right moments. Not one of your ancestors, not a single one, going back through hominins and mammals and reptiles and fish and single-celled patterns in ancient seas, could have failed to reproduce. Every ancestor of yours, without exception, survived long enough to pass life onward. Break the chain anywhere, and the specific arrangement now listening does not appear. And there is a small further wrinkle astronomers have quietly enjoyed pointing out. The stars themselves are moving. Our sun is slowly drifting through the galaxy, carrying us along at a speed of hundreds of thousands of miles per hour. The whole solar system is spiraling around the galactic center, taking roughly 230 million years to complete a single circuit, which means the exact spatial coordinates of your birth were coordinates the Earth had never been at before, and will never be at again. The particular point in the galaxy where you first opened your eyes was, in a very real sense, a one-time only address. Some listeners might hear all this and feel small, but that is not quite the shape of the wonder here, because small is a comparison, and comparisons need something to compare against. What is really being said is stranger. Among all the possible configurations of matter and time the universe could have taken, this one, the one where you are lying somewhere warm on a summer night, listening to a voice, is one particular configuration that actually occurred, and you are inside it, not observing it, inside. Some voices in physics have called this specificity cosmic address uniqueness. Others speak more poetically of the one flame at these coordinates. The mathematics does not need such language, but the imagination does, because it is difficult, without images, to hold the fact that of all the empty places in the observable universe, vast dark stretches between galaxies, unlit cinders of dead stars, silent gas clouds, there are a few, very few, warm interior rooms with living listeners in them tonight, and this happens to be one. There is a quiet ambiguity in this that different listeners will hold in their own way. Some will feel that these coordinates arose by natural processes, one improbable event stacked on another, until, against long odds, you appeared, Others will feel that the depth of the coincidence gestures toward an intention older than the physics that carries it, and that the here and now of your existence is not accidental. Science, once again, does not close either reading. It notes the coordinates. It does not say who or what, if anything, chose them. That deeper question lives in the same quiet room where the great traditions have always sat. But whichever reading you gently prefer, notice a soft turn that this whole chapter has been leading toward. For 13.8 billion years, this small set of coordinates in space and time was empty of you. Not because you were being denied access, but because the coordinates themselves were still being prepared. A galaxy still forming, a star still cooling, a planet still cooling, ancestors still meeting, a body still being knit inside a womb. There was no waiting room outside these coordinates where a small you sat impatiently, checking a clock. There was only the slow, unhurried arrival of the conditions in which you would eventually be found. And here you are, at last, at those precise coordinates. Not everywhere, not always, only here, only now, a candle at a very specific point in the cosmic web, quietly aware, quietly resting, quietly listening. The long dark did not delay you, it delivered you. More than 2,000 years ago, on a small parcel of land outside the noisy city of Athens, a philosopher named Epicurus kept a garden. He gathered friends there. He wrote in careful, plain-spoken sentences. He spent much of his life trying to help people be less afraid of pain, of the gods as they were then imagined, and most of all of death. And one of his most famous consolations was strangely simple. He said, in effect, that death is nothing to us, because when death is present, we are not, and when we are present, death is not. Therefore, the two never actually meet. At first hearing, this can feel like a clever trick, as though he is dodging the fear with a wordplay. But if you sit with it a while, in the quiet of a night like this one, the argument begins to open into something more tender. His point was not to deny the sadness of loss or the difficulty of dying. He was pointing at something more specific, the fear of non-existence itself, the imagined dread of being in a state of not being. Epicurus noticed something quiet and important. For a state to be dreadful, there must be a subject inside it who dreads. Someone must be there, feeling the weight of the darkness, and by the strict definition of non-existence, no one is there. There is no subject in the empty chair. The chair is empty precisely because there is no one to sit in it. So the fear, when examined gently, is picturing a version of the self trapped inside an experience that, by definition, no self is present for. It is like imagining being inside a room after you have quietly walked out of it. There is no you in that room, and so there is no dread there either. The dread lives only in the mind that is still safely in another room, imagining the empty one from outside. Epicurus was not the only voice to notice this shape. Long after him, the philosopher Derek Parfit returned to the argument in the late 20th century, gently sharpening it. Parfit acknowledged something Epicurus did not fully address, that human minds are naturally biased toward the future. We tend to fear future absence more than we grieve past absence. If someone told you that you would have a headache last Tuesday, you might not care much. If someone told you that you would have one next Tuesday, you might feel a small dread. That imbalance is likely wired into us for reasons that helped our ancestors survive. It helps us plan and protect ourselves. But Parfit noted, carefully, that this bias is about our attention, not about the pure nature of the absence itself. If we could set aside the tilt for a moment and look at the pre-birth silence and the post-life silence side by side, they would look the same. Both are empty of a witness. Both contain no dread, because there is no dreader. The fact that one lies behind us and one lies ahead of us does not in itself change their inner shape. Now, please hear this with care. Neither Epicurus nor Parfit was claiming to know the ultimate nature of the self, or what may or may not lie beyond the reach of our instruments. Epicurus was a materialist by the standards of his time, and Parfit had his own views, but their arguments are logical, not metaphysical. They are saying only this: if non-existence is truly non-existence, a state without a subject, then it cannot by definition contain the felt suffering the anxious mind imagines. Whether some deeper form of continuation exists beyond the body, is not something their argument settles. Many traditions have long held that the soul is not identical to the changing patterns of the brain. That view is not touched by Epicurus's mirror. It stands wherever it stood. What the mirror does gently touch is the specific fear of non-existence as a felt state. That fear, when we look at it carefully, is looking at a picture that cannot actually occur. The picture is of a subject inside an absence, but every absence in which a subject appears is not really absence. It is just a very lonely room. There is a soft image that some readers of Epicurus have used across the centuries. Imagine a candle that is not yet lit. It is not sitting in darkness. Darkness needs someone to notice it. The candle is simply not present as light. It has not yet been struck. The room around it does not miss it. And then, at some point, someone strikes it. And now there is a small warm flame that can look around and marvel at the room it finds itself in. And later, one day, the flame will go out, and the candle will not return to the dark. It will simply, quietly, no longer be a flame. Whether some deeper flame continues elsewhere, in some way beyond the wax and wick, is a mystery this argument does not resolve. It leaves that door respectfully open. Different traditions have offered their own careful answers, and thoughtful people have held them with sincerity for many centuries. But even inside that openness, notice how much softer the mind can feel when the specific dread of being in the empty chair is set aside. Because that dread was never quite right. The empty chair was never a suffering place. It was empty, and you have already walked through a very long room full of such chairs, the vast pre-birth silence, and you were not sitting in any of them. So Epicurus, from his garden 2,000 years ago, offers you a simple gift for tonight. Not a proof about the ultimate, just a small correction to a picture the mind was drawing. He says gently, the empty chair does not hurt you, because you are not in it. And when the anxious mind understands even that much, really understands it, a small warm knot inside the chest can begin, quietly, to loosen. There is another very old way of holding this same territory, and it comes from further east. In the world of early Buddhist thought, especially in traditions that grew slowly across India and then across much of Asia, teachers have quietly turned the same question over, not what happens when a self dies, but something more subtle. What is a self really, moment to moment, and how tightly does it need to be held? One of the central ideas here is often given the name anatta, which is usually translated as not self. It is a phrase that has been misunderstood in many ways over the years. It does not mean that you do not exist. It does not mean that your experiences are illusions in a dismissive sense. It is a gentler observation. When you look closely at any part of what you call me, you find that it is always changing. Your body of a year ago is different from your body now. Your thoughts of yesterday are different from your thoughts of today. Your sense of who you are as a child differs from your sense of who you are as an adult. And yet the story of I keeps being told throughout all of that changing. The early Buddhist teachers noticed this softness in the self, and they gently invited students to sit with it. Not to erase the sense of I, daily life needs it, but to loosen its grip, to notice that the I is not a hard little pebble inside you, but more like a pattern of waves on the surface of a lake, real, beautiful, constantly reformed. Alongside this, there is another old idea, sometimes called dependent origination. In its simplest shape, it points out that nothing exists on its own. Every arising is supported by many other arisings. A candle needs wax, wick, oxygen, a spark, a room. A thought needs a brain, a body, a memory, a language, a moment. When any of the supports change, the thing that depends on them changes too. So the self is not only fluid, it is also woven into everything around it. It cannot be cleanly separated out. Now, this may sound very abstract, but something remarkable has happened in the past few decades. Modern neuroscientists, working with experienced meditators, have begun to notice that certain contemplative practices can quietly shift how the brain represents the self. Studies of ego dissolution during deep meditation and of similar states induced by careful clinical work with certain psychedelic compounds have shown temporary changes in the activity of the default mode network. the same network we spoke of earlier, which weaves together the sense of being someone. During certain deep meditative states, some meditators describe a softening of the usual boundary between self and world. The room does not disappear, the body does not vanish, but the tight edge between me and everything else thins out. There is still awareness, there is still experience, but the small, worried center that usually calls itself I is gently held with more spaciousness, and measurements of the brain during these moments have shown reduced activity in parts of the default mode network, consistent with a temporary loosening of the strongly self-referential mode. This work is still young, and researchers are careful. They are not claiming that such experiences prove anything final about the nature of the self. They are only saying that the sense of being a bounded I can be, in practice, more flexible than it usually feels. It can be softened, it can be loosened, and when it is loosened, most people report not fear, but a strange quiet, a kind of coming home to something that was always there, underneath the noise. Consider what this could gently mean for tonight's slow question. If the sense of being a firm, bounded self is already more fluid than we assumed, then the vast pre-birth stretch was not a violence done to some hard little core. It was simply a period in which the pattern of arisings that eventually became you had not yet gathered. The wave had not risen yet on the surface of the lake, and when it did not appear from nowhere. It appeared in this contemplative view because many other conditions had gathered. Ancestors, atoms, worlds, moments, enough of them to allow the wave to lift briefly into shape. Different traditions frame this differently. Some Buddhist traditions have spoken about currents of consciousness that continue across lifetimes in ways that other traditions describe differently or hold with different intuitions. This is delicate territory. It is not for tonight to argue any particular interpretation. What is worth noticing is only that the Buddhist pause quietly agrees with what we sensed earlier from a very different angle. The self is not the hard little pebble we usually imagine. It is more like a pattern that arose, exists for a while, and will one day settle back into the stillness from which it lifted. And here is a small gift the Buddhist pause offers, alongside the Epicurean one, where Epicurus quiets the dread by pointing out that no one sits in the empty chair. The contemplative traditions of the East quiet the dread by softening the sense that the chair was ever occupied by a rigid, permanent self in the first place. They suggest that you, even in the middle of a busy day, are already a gentle unfolding rather than a fixed object. And if you are a gentle unfolding, then the vast dark before your unfolding and the vast dark after it are not the destruction of some solid thing. They are only stretches of quiet before and after a small pattern arose to notice itself. Sitting with this idea, especially in the softness of a night like this, the mind can breathe a little more slowly, because it turns out that whether we approach the long dark from a Greek garden 2,000 years ago, or from a monastery in the mountains, or from a lab of contemporary neuroscientists watching the default mode network quiet in a scanner, the message is not so different. The self is softer than the fear assumes, the dark is softer than the fear assumes, and what waits beneath both is not necessarily the horror the anxious mind pictures. Whatever waits at the deepest edge, and honest inquiry keeps that door open, the shape of the passage is not the crushing thing the untrained imagination paints. There is a very old habit in the human family that no scientific instrument has ever been able to measure. It is the habit of sensing that a life, though it moves through a body, is not simply the same as the body, that there is something inside a person, a soul, a spirit, a light, that is not fully captured by scans of the brain or by the equations of physics. This intuition is not the property of any single tradition. It has appeared in countless forms across almost every culture on Earth. In the Christian tradition, this intuition has been shaped for 2,000 years by the belief that each person is loved into being by a creator, and that what a person truly is does not end where the body ends. Whether one speaks of the resurrection of the body or of the soul returning to God, the underlying picture is that the deepest core of a self is held in a life larger than the biological one. Different Christian communities hold this in different ways, some in more literal images, some in more mystical ones, but the door to a life beyond the reach of instruments is not in this tradition closed. In Islam, The same door is held with its own careful language. There is a strong sense that a soul, breathed into the body at a particular moment, remains distinct from the flesh that houses it. The life of this world is understood as a small, meaningful stretch, a testing and a mercy, inside a much larger arc that extends beyond death into a state that many Muslims describe with reverence and quiet detail. Once again, the door is open. Once again, the instruments of science are seen as competent to describe the body, while remaining of themselves silent about the deeper matter. In Judaism, in Hinduism, in Sikhism, in the many streams of Buddhism, in the indigenous traditions of countless peoples, and in countless personal, non-institutional forms of faith, similar doors are held. They differ in the details. They differ, sometimes deeply, in how they picture what lies beyond. But they share a certain shape. They agree gently that a life is not necessarily the same as a body, and that the fullest question of what a person is cannot be answered by measuring cells alone. Now, in a night like this, we are not here to declare which of these doors is the correct one. That is not the work of a slow contemplative script. Different listeners will bring their own faith, their own doubt, their own quiet mixture of both. What is worth noticing tonight is only this. On the deepest question, what happens to the you when the body's story ends? Science, by its own honest admission, does not have the final word. Its instruments observe the brain and the body, and they observe them beautifully, but whether some subtler continuity exists beyond that observation is precisely the kind of question the instruments were not built to answer. Many careful scientists have said this in their own way. They have said that the tools of neuroscience can describe correlations. This pattern of brain activity accompanies this experience, but that the deeper question of why any inner experience arises at all, or what such experience truly is, remains one of the great open puzzles. Philosophers sometimes call it the hard problem of consciousness, and it sits, respectfully, alongside the older question of the soul, not identical to it, but not obviously against it either, which means the great traditions and modern science do not stand on opposite sides of a wall, as they are sometimes painted. Science is honest about what it can and cannot see, and the traditions are honest about the territory their long conversations have been walking through. On the deepest edge, the two often meet in a kind of shared silence, not agreement in every detail, but a shared willingness to say, with humility, that the question of what a person truly is cannot be settled by a single method. There is a particular gentleness in this, especially for a mind that turns and turns at night, because if you carry a faith, quietly or strongly, that a soul continues beyond the reach of the body, the ideas we have been exploring do not contradict that. The vast pre-birth silence and the mirror argument do not close your door. They only offer a small comfort about the fear of non-existence as a felt state, while leaving your deeper hope, whatever it is, entirely intact. And if you carry no such faith, or carry only questions, the same territory is still hospitable. The traditions are not shouting at you. Many of them, in their most contemplative streams, have spoken of the soul with such tenderness that even a listener without settled belief can feel welcomed to sit near the door without being asked to walk through it. The mystics of many faiths, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, and many others, have long insisted that what they are pointing at is beyond words. That is one reason their poetry so often sounds like the same poetry, whichever language it appears in. So here, in the quiet middle of the night, we can hold both hands open at once. On one hand, the honest limits of what science can currently say. On the other, the honest depths of what traditions have long said. Neither is asked, tonight, to defeat the other. They can sit near each other, like two people at the same still pond, watching the light change on the water. And when the mind reaches out, at bedtime, toward the vast dark on the other side of the interval, we can let both hands stay open. Whatever waits there is not a mechanical fact we can pin down here. It may be less than the anxious mind fears. It may be more than any of our theories describe. What we can say is that the deep quiet of the pre-birth silence, which we have walked through together, does not close any of these doors. It only closes a small door, the door of pure dread, that was never quite where the deepest question was asked in the first place. Modern physics has, in recent decades, spent a great deal of quiet effort on a very strange question. It is not directly a question about the soul or about life after death. It is a question about information, specifically, whether the information contained in the universe, the patterns, the arrangements, the details of who and what a system is, can ever be truly destroyed. To many people who have not spent time in physics, this may sound like an odd thing to ask. Of course, information can be destroyed, we might think. Burn a book, erase a hard drive, watch a snowflake melt. Surely the arrangement is gone. But if you follow the mathematics of physics carefully, at the deep level of quantum mechanics, something surprising appears. According to the equations that have been tested countless times, the total information about a physical system is preserved. Even if a book is burned, in principle every detail of every ink stroke could be reconstructed from the pattern of the smoke, the ash, the heat, the tiny movements of every particle involved. Nothing is truly lost. It is only scrambled in a way that no practical instrument could ever unscramble. But the mathematics says it is still there, in principle. Then, in the 20th century, along came black holes, and with them a puzzle. Black holes, according to Stephen Hawking's famous work, do not simply devour everything forever. They also, very slowly, emit a faint radiation now often called Hawking radiation. And if this radiation is truly random and the black hole eventually evaporates completely, then it seemed at first that the information about everything that had fallen in, every book, every star, every particle, would be truly lost, which would contradict a very deep principle in physics. This became known as the black hole information paradox, and it has kept physicists gently arguing with each other for decades. Some proposed that the information leaks out subtly in the pattern of the radiation, encoded in ways so intricate that no one could reconstruct it, but present nonetheless. Others explored bolder ideas, that black holes might store information on their surface in strange ways, or that the geometry of space-time near a black hole might work differently than we thought. Stephen Hawking himself, later in his life, gently revised his position, coming to suspect that the information probably does escape after all, in some hidden way. Recent work using more advanced mathematics has offered further clues, but the debate is not fully settled. Now, we should be careful here, especially in the mood of a night like this, because it can be tempting to reach across from this piece of physics into the deeper mystery of the self and say something bold. To claim, for example, that because information is never destroyed, the you of your life is somehow preserved in the fabric of reality, that is more than the physics can carry. The information the equations talk about is not the same as the felt I of a life. The mathematics describes the microscopic arrangement of particles, the positions, the states, the relations. It says nothing directly about experience. It does not tell us whether the small warm feeling of being someone is captured in that arrangement, or whether that feeling is something else, something the physics has not learnt to name. So the information question does not answer, on its own, what happens to a self at the edge of life. Different thoughtful voices interpret it differently. Some hear in it a small hint that patterns, in some deep sense, are not simply lost. Others say it is a purely mathematical claim about matter and should not be borrowed for questions about consciousness. Many traditions, including the older ones we spoke of, would say that whatever the physics finds about information, the deeper question of the soul lies quietly elsewhere, in a place the equations were not built to visit. What the information question does gently offer, though, is a metaphor, and metaphors, held loosely, can be soft companions in a night like this. Consider what it means, even at the level of matter, that the pattern of who you are might not be as fragile as we sometimes imagine. Every conversation you have had, every step you have taken, every laugh, every held hand, every small kindness, each of these has, in some sense, altered the arrangement of the world around you. Molecules of air carried the sound of your voice outward. Photons carried the light of your smile into every room you entered. The temperature of a hand you held, however briefly, was subtly changed. These are not romantic exaggerations, they are literal, physical consequences of your having been present. And if physics is right that the microscopic information of these interactions is not destroyed, only scrambled, only dispersed, only softened beyond any human ability to read, then, in a very quiet sense, the pattern of your life is not going to be erased. It is going to be woven into the fabric of everything you touched, whether or not any instrument can ever recover it. This is not the same as saying you will personally continue. That question, again, is deeper than the physics. But there is a small tenderness in the thought that your presence in the world is not a temporary scribble that will be wiped clean. It is more like a long, complicated pattern of touches that the universe, in its own quiet accounting, does not entirely lose. Some listeners will hold this loosely, as a metaphor. Others will hold it alongside deeper hopes about what continues in ways science cannot yet describe. Both are welcome here. Neither is asked to defeat the other. Together, they offer a small softening for the fear that a life is a candle that leaves nothing behind when it goes out. The wick may cool, but the room, in some subtle way, is not exactly the same room it was before the candle was lit, and the pattern of everything the candle warmed keeps flowing forward in ways too many for any single instrument to trace. At some point in a long, patient night of thinking about questions like these, the honest mind gently arrives at a place that used to feel uncomfortable, and quietly discovers that it is not. That place is not knowing. For most of a life, not knowing is a nervous feeling. It is what makes us search for answers, argue for opinions, look at our phones one more time. Uncertainty tends to be treated as a problem, a temporary state to be solved. But in the deep questions, what a self is, why there is anything at all, what waits beyond the reach of the instruments, not knowing turns out to be less a problem and more the honest condition of being a small, tender mind inside a vast, ancient universe. The American philosopher and psychologist William James, more than a century ago, spent much of his life thinking about the varieties of human experience. He listened, without dismissiveness, to mystics, to skeptics, to scientists, to ordinary people describing quiet moments of awe. He was struck, over and over, by how many different kinds of inner experience there are, and how difficult it is for any single framework to hold them all. He came to feel that the human situation is genuinely open, not in a wishy-washy sense, but in the sense that reality is deeper than our current maps, and that any honest life has to live inside that depth without pretending to have finished it. This is a kind of not knowing that is not lazy. It is not a shrug. It is more like the not knowing of a person standing at the edge of a vast, calm sea in the early morning. They know something about water. They know something about tides. They know a great deal about the shore they are standing on. But they also know that most of the sea is beyond them. And instead of finding that upsetting, they gradually come to find it beautiful. Tonight, we have been walking along the edge of that sea from several different directions, from physics, from ancient philosophy, from modern neuroscience, from contemplative traditions, from the quiet doors of the great faiths, from gentle mathematical metaphors about information. Each of these has offered a small piece of the shore. None of them has captured the whole sea. There is a quiet comfort in noticing that this is okay, because if any of them had captured the whole sea, we would have a very different kind of night. We would have a lecture, we would have a manual, we would have a manifesto. Instead, what we have is something older and softer, a conversation, a gathering of small candles, each casting light on a small part of the water. Together, they light more of it than anyone could alone, but even together they do not, and cannot, light all of it. And that is not a failure of the candles, it is a description of how big the sea is. Some listeners will find, in this arrangement, room for a personal faith they already carry, a faith that names the deeper sea in a way that gives them peace. That faith is welcome to sit here in the small warm circle of the candles, without being challenged. Other listeners will find themselves without such a name for the sea, holding only questions and a quiet respect for how deep the water goes. They are welcome too. What matters is that no one is being asked, tonight, to pretend the sea is smaller than it is. There is a small psychological finding, softly relevant here, that many contemporary researchers on well-being have noticed. People who report the greatest ease around the deep questions of life and death are not usually the ones with the most certainty. They tend to be the ones with the most gentle openness. Not people who have decided everything, but people who have accepted that some things are not decidable in this life, and who have gently made peace with that, instead of endlessly wrestling with it. The mind, when it is asked to close a door prematurely, often becomes tense. When it is allowed to leave the door softly open, without demanding an answer from behind it, it can rest. You have already lived through a very long stretch of not knowing. You did not know, as a small child, what the world was. You did not know, in the years before memory, where you were going. You did not know, in 10,000 small moments of your life, how the story would turn. And here you are, still whole, still able to breathe slowly in a warm room, listening to a voice that is not asking you to be certain of anything. Perhaps the deepest thing this chapter has been leaning toward is this. The comfort at the end of the philosophy of the painless dark is not a comfort of conclusions, it is a comfort of company. Many minds, across many centuries, have stood at the same edge you are standing at tonight. They have offered different words for what lies beyond. They have disagreed with each other, sometimes strongly, but they have also, in their quieter moments, agreed on one small thing, that the mystery is not our enemy, that the deep questions are, in a way, our home. To rest in that home does not require solving it. It only requires letting the questions be old friends. Some of them will walk with you a while, and then slip back into the dark. Others will keep you company for the rest of your life, changing shape as you change. And when eventually the small candle of this life dims, and whatever waits beyond that dimming waits, the very same not knowing will be there, but now on the other side, and it may turn out to be, as it has always turned out to be, softer than the fear expected. There is a way of looking at your life that, at first, sounds unbearably small, and then, as you sit with it, becomes strangely tender. Imagine the whole history of the universe, those 13.8 billion years, pressed into a single day, 24 hours from beginning to now. On that scale, the Earth itself does not form until well into the afternoon. The first simple life appears in the early evening. Complex creatures come only in the last hour. All of recorded human history, pyramids, empires, cities, sciences, symphonies, fits inside the last few seconds before midnight, and your own life, however long you are given, takes place inside a tiny sliver of those seconds. Geologists sometimes work with a similar scale, called deep time. They think in millions of years the way most of us think in weeks. When they read the layers of rock in a cliff face, they see whole epochs stacked one on top of another, ages of glaciers, ages of forests that no human ever walked in, ages when the continents were arranged in shapes we would not recognize, and in all of those ages you were not there, not as a body, not as a name, not even as a possibility with a return address. So your life, viewed against this backdrop, is very brief. That is simply true. But now notice something else. In all of those long ages, no matter how much was happening, no matter how many mountains were rising, how many oceans were opening, how many strange animals were walking across landscapes now buried under 100 cities, none of that time contained an experience of long. There was no one holding a clock, feeling the ages drag. The universe was busy. It was not bored. Boredom, like everything else, needs a subject. And here, in this small bright interval, is where the subjects live. You, the people you love, the strangers on the other side of the world, listening to their own voices, in their own quiet rooms, a few billion warm rooms scattered across a small blue planet, in a small corner of a large galaxy, all lit up briefly, all humming with experience, all held between two vast silences that never notice anything. There is a delicate turn worth making here, because it changes how the smallness feels. If the long ages before you contain no experience of length, then your life is not a tiny sliver in a much larger endurance. It is not that the universe felt 3 billion years of boredom and then let you have 80 years of experience as a small consolation. That is not the shape. The shape is stranger and gentler. The universe felt nothing for most of its history. And then, inside a very brief interval, in certain warm pockets, it began to feel something through you, through the small candles like you. For a while, in you the cosmos wakes up enough to notice itself. Astronomers and philosophers of science have gently pointed out this remarkable feature of our situation. All of the universe's long dark stretches passed without any inner point of view. It is only in the small, late, unlikely warm rooms where minds have formed that anything is felt at all, which means that whatever inner life the universe has ever had, it has had it through beings like you. Your interval is short, but it is not a small piece of a much larger felt story. It is one of the rare places where felt story exists at all. This does not make you the center of the universe. That is not what is being said. Many other candles are lit at the same time as yours. Many were lit before yours. Many will be lit after. But the fact that your interval is brief does not make it smaller in importance than the vast dark around it. In some quiet sense, it makes it more precious, because experience is not scattered evenly through cosmic time. It is concentrated in these small warm intervals where the conditions permit it. And so, when the mind at night says, "You are so small compared to the ages," you can answer very softly that this small interval is exactly where the ages finally became something more than physics. This is where a bit of the universe learned to know it was a universe, not permanently, not fully, but enough that, right now, a small piece of the cosmos is listening to a voice speaking from another small piece of the cosmos and finding it, gently, meaningful. The bright interval is brief, but it is not tucked inside a felt eternity of dark on either side. It is one of the very few places where the universe feels anything at all, and that fact, quietly, does not shrink your life. It quietly, unexpectedly honors it. Under your skin tonight is a very old story that you did not have to memorize in order to carry. It is written in the coils of your DNA, in the tiny molecular library inside each of your cells, and it goes back further than the invention of language, further than the emergence of humans, further than the appearance of any animal you would recognize. Every cell in your body contains a copy of a set of instructions that has been passed forward, generation by generation, since life began on Earth. Not the same molecules, those are constantly rebuilt, but the same information, copied and copied and copied again with astonishing fidelity. Small errors have crept in along the way. Some have been erased, some have flourished. Together, these tiny variations have quietly written the story of every living thing you have ever seen. Scientists who study what is sometimes called the molecular clock have used this fact in beautiful ways. By comparing the DNA of different species, they can estimate how long ago two lineages shared a common ancestor. Humans and chimpanzees, for instance, share so much of their DNA that our two lineages seem to have split only a few million years ago. Humans and mice share less, and their split is much older. Humans and single-celled creatures share still less, but there is still something in common, because we all descend from the very earliest patterns of life that took hold on this planet, billions of years ago. Which means that if you trace the family history inside your own cells backward, you do not stop at your parents. You do not stop at your grandparents. You do not stop at your great-great-great-grandparents living in a village whose name has been lost. You keep going, past every ancestor whose face has been forgotten, past the earliest humans, past the earliest primates, past small mammals scurrying under the feet of dinosaurs, past strange fish learning to breathe air on the edges of ancient seas, past soft-bodied creatures in warm oceans older than any continent you have ever heard of, past patterns of life so simple that no one would call them animals, until eventually you arrive at something that was barely alive at all, a small chemistry that learned, somehow, to copy itself. Every one of those steps, every hardship, every close escape, every long, quiet stretch of survival is quietly carried in the code that is currently keeping you alive. The long dark before your birth is not, in this sense, entirely dark. It is written into you. Every heartbeat is powered by a pattern that has been beating in one form or another for billions of years. There is something gentle in this to hold at bedtime, because if you sometimes feel small, or new, or unsteady, it can help to remember that the body listening to this voice tonight is not a fresh, isolated thing. It is a very long story momentarily gathered into a person. The instructions inside your cells were tested by droughts you will never know about, by ice ages your ancestors survived, by predators long extinct, by illnesses whose names have been forgotten, and every single one of those pressures was passed, gently, by the ancestors who lived long enough to carry the pattern forward. Not one of your ancestors in an unbroken chain going back to the earliest life, failed to pass life on. If they had, you would not be here. You do not have to remember any of this to have benefited from it. You do not have to know a single ancestor's name. Your body simply carries their gift, quietly, in every cell. It is a strange thought. You are the current chapter in a book so long that the earlier chapters have been lost, but the story has never stopped. The book is still being read. You are the sentence being read tonight. Some traditions across the world have long sensed something like this, though in different words. Many speak of ancestors as still present, quietly, in the lives of the living. Different cultures hold this in different ways, some literal, some symbolic, some deeply spiritual. Science does not make claims about the specific presence of ancestors as felt beings. It only notes with quiet awe the physical reality that every cell of you is a direct continuation of a lineage stretching back to the earliest life on Earth. What that means beyond biology is left, respectfully, to the deeper conversations we spoke of earlier. Still, at a purely biological level, the picture is remarkable. You are not simply a person who happens to exist. You are the current living edge of a long, patient survival. The long dark before your birth is not a stranger to you. Its story is stitched into every strand of DNA, in every cell. In a very small, quiet way, the vast time behind you has already made itself part of the small, warm body listening to this voice. There is a soft version of the imagination that most of us never try, because it feels almost too tender. Try, gently, to picture all the people who have ever lived on Earth, every child ever born, every grandmother, every farmer, every scholar, every stranger you would never have known. Anthropologists have estimated that somewhere between 100 billion and 120 billion humans, in various forms, have lived across our species' history. Every one of them had a face. Every one of them had a name that mattered to someone. Every one of them, at some quiet moment, watched a sky darken exactly as yours will darken tonight. Now widen the picture just a little further. Add the earlier forms of humans that we no longer see, Neanderthals, whose remains have been carefully studied for more than a century, Denisovans, discovered relatively recently through fragments of bone found in a Siberian cave, other, earlier lineages of humans and near-humans whose stories are only partly known. Each of them was a lineage of warm rooms, lit for a time on this same planet, breathing the same kind of air, watching the same slow turn of stars. Paleogenomics, the science of reading DNA from ancient bones, has quietly changed our picture of the past in recent decades. It has shown, for example, that many people alive today carry small traces of Neanderthal ancestry in their genomes, and some carry traces of Denisovan ancestry as well. This means that these earlier peoples did not simply disappear. They live on, quietly, inside modern lineages, in ways we are only beginning to understand. Their long, patient survival is another layer of the story that is currently keeping you alive. Now widen the picture one more time. Consider all the people who could have existed but did not, all the unborn siblings of every generation, all the children whose grandparents never met, every love story that came close to happening but was interrupted by a war, a distance, a small misunderstanding, every possible person who was only ever one small chance away from being here, and yet, for whatever reason, was not. Some listeners, hearing this, might feel a kind of quiet sadness. So many almost people, so many candles that were never struck. But the emotional shape of the thought does not have to be sadness. It can be something gentler. Because notice, gently, that none of those almost people are sitting in a dark room waiting to have existed. There is no waiting hall of unborn souls being tapped on the shoulder while some are picked and others are left. The almost people are not enduring anything, any more than the vast pre-birth silence you walked through was enduring anything. They are simply patterns that were not, in this world, lit. Whether their possibility exists in some deeper way beyond our instruments is another kind of question, held differently by different traditions. Science, once again, has no claim to close that door. What we can say is this: among all the possible people who could have been you, only this one was actually formed. You are one lit window in a long dim street. Some other windows are lit at the same time as yours, the people you love, the strangers you brush past, the voices you overhear. Many windows have already gone quiet. Many more will be lit after yours. And the street itself, seen from far enough away, is astonishing. This long, warm chain of small rooms in which the universe learned briefly to be someone. There is a soft gratitude that can grow from this if we let it. Not a boastful gratitude that says, I am special and the others are not. That is not the right shape. It is more like the gratitude of someone who was invited, at the last minute, into a warm house on a cold night. They know they did not earn it. They know that many others could have been in this chair, and so they sit in the chair very gently, with a certain reverence, because they know how easily this seat could have belonged to someone else, or to no one at all. This is not a heavy thought, it is a settling thought. It quietly turns down the volume on some of the more frantic ways the modern mind tries to prove that a life matters. You do not have to earn your seat in the world by performance or achievement or fame. You are already, simply by being here, one of the small, unlikely candles lit inside the long, dim street. That is not a small thing. And when you think of the ones who waited without ever being lit, the almost siblings, the almost friends, the almost lovers, the vast archive of possible people who did not in this world appear, the mind can hold them softly, not as ghosts and not as regrets, just as the wider background against which you actually happen. They quietly frame the fact that you, of all the possible unfoldings, are the one currently listening. The long dark before your birth was full, in this sense, not of your suffering, you were not there, but of possibilities being sifted. And somehow, tonight, out of all of those possibilities, one small warm room in the long dim street belongs to you. There is an old worry that many people quietly carry, though they may not always name it. It goes something like this. If a life is brief, and if everything eventually softens back into silence, then does anything a person does really matter? If nothing lasts forever, does anything matter now? Different traditions and thinkers have answered this in different ways. Some have said that only what lasts forever can matter, and so they place all their meaning inside a permanence that lies beyond this life. Others have said that meaning is entirely local and human, and that no permanence is needed for a life to be worth living. Many careful people have found a place somewhere between the two. But there is a particular voice worth listening to on this question, because he lived through some of the most extreme conditions the 20th century produced. A Viennese psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl survived the Nazi concentration camps and afterward wrote gently about what he had learned. He noticed something surprising. Even in the worst conditions imaginable, he found that people who could find meaning, small, specific, deeply personal meaning, tended to endure with a kind of quiet dignity, while those who lost the sense of meaning often gave up more quickly. Frankl came to believe that human beings do not primarily crave pleasure or power, they crave meaning, and meaning, he suggested, is not something the universe is required to hand to us. It is something we participate in through the small, specific acts of a specific life. Importantly, Frankl did not argue that meaning required a life without end. He suggested that a meaningful moment, once lived, is in a certain sense untouchable. It has already happened. The good you did today cannot be undone, even if you are forgotten tomorrow. The kindness you offered a stranger, the honest word you gave a friend, the quiet effort you made in your own inner life, all of these are woven into the actual history of the universe. The universe, as we sometimes say, does not have an eraser for events that have already occurred. Modern psychology has quietly explored similar territory in recent years. Researchers who study awe and meaning have noticed that experiences of awe, standing before mountains, watching a night sky, sitting with a piece of music, often produce something they sometimes call the small self, not smallness in the crushing sense, but a soft loosening of the tight, worried everyday self, and its replacement, briefly, with a more spacious sense of belonging to something larger. People who experience these moments of the small self often report feeling more generous, more connected, more at peace, and more able to hold uncertainty. In this state, questions like, "Does my brief life matter?" tend not to sting in the same way. Not because the questions have been answered, but because the anxious grip inside the question has softened. You may have felt something like this without ever using the words. A quiet evening when the sky turned a certain color and something in your chest loosened. A conversation with a person you love in which time seemed to slow. A moment of listening to music alone in a car when the small self became gently transparent and you were, for a few seconds, more than the story you usually tell about yourself. These are not tricks of the mind. They are, for many researchers, glimpses of a mode of being that is available to us regularly, though we tend to visit it rarely. Now hold this alongside the arc of tonight. If meaning does not require permanence, if a good act does not need to last forever to be real, if a kind glance across a room does not need to be remembered by history to be counted, then the brevity of your life is not, in itself, a threat to its meaning. The interval is brief, but the interval is where the actual meaning-making happens. And notice something quiet here. The vast time before your birth was not a stretch during which meaning was being accumulated somewhere else and waiting to be handed to you. It was a stretch without meaning-making, because there was no one there to make meaning. Meaning arises where minds arise. It is one of the extraordinary features of the small, warm interval where you now live. So the brief, bright interval is not just where you happen to be, it is where meaning happens at all, in the local universe you can reach. Different traditions add their own further layers to this thought. Some hold that beyond the reach of our instruments, a larger meaning is being held by something older than the physics. That view is welcomed here without argument. Others live entirely inside the meaning that arises in this life, and hold that as enough. That view is welcomed too. What we can share, quietly, tonight, is that in either case the acts and moments of your interval are not erased by their brevity. They happen. They are stitched into the actual fabric of what has been. You do not have to make your life vast for it to be meaningful. You only have to live inside it with a little more attention, a little more kindness, a little more presence. The small candle does not need to be a bonfire to warm a room. It only needs to burn steadily where it is, and the room, quietly, notices, even when no one else is watching. There is one gentle question that we have been circling all night, softly, without pressing on it too hard. It is the question of what waits at the other end of the small bright interval, the far silence ahead. For a night designed for sleep, and for a mind that has been walking through big thoughts for a long time now, it is worth turning toward this question with the same quietness we have brought to everything else. The earlier chapters have already given us a small foundation. We saw that the vast pre-birth silence was not painful, because no subject was there to feel it. We saw, from ancient philosophy, that no one occupies the empty chair. We saw, from many contemplative traditions, that the sense of a fixed self is softer than it usually feels. We saw, from modern neuroscience, that the mind quietly loosens its grip every night in deep sleep and returns unharmed. From all of these directions, the same shape emerged. The absence of a witness is not a form of suffering. It cannot be by definition. Now, at the same time, the deeper question of what a self ultimately is, and what may or may not continue when the body's story ends, remains open. Science observes the brain and the body. It has not, in any final way, closed the door on whether some subtler continuation exists beyond its instruments. Many traditions across the world have long held that a soul, in some form, continues, and they hold this with sincerity and care. Different listeners tonight will carry different intuitions here, and each is welcome. This part of the night does not ask you to settle a question that even the wisest minds across history have held with humility. What we can share is a small softness about the shape of the passage itself, because if the pre-birth silence, seen honestly, was not the crushing thing the anxious mind imagines, then by simple symmetry, the far silence at the other end need not be either. Whatever waits beyond the reach of our instruments, a continuation, a transformation, or something we do not yet have words for, the passage itself, seen from the outside, is not obviously more painful than any of the other transitions we have already walked through: falling asleep, being sedated for a small surgery, losing the years of infancy to memory. Each of these is a small loosening of the ordinary self, and each of them, on the other side, we survive. There is a soft image that some contemplative traditions have used for centuries. They speak of dying as being like removing a heavy coat at the end of a long day. The person is still there. The coat is not the person. In some traditions, the coat is set aside forever. In others, the coat is exchanged for a lighter one, or the person walks into a room where coats are no longer needed. In each case, though, the removal of the coat is not the same as the ending of the person. It is only the change in what they were wearing. We should be careful, again, not to overclaim. This is a picture, not a proof. Science does not confirm the coat metaphor. It also does not deny it. The mystery remains what it is, but for a listener at night, looking gently ahead to the far silence, it can help to have images that treat the passage kindly, rather than with dread. Many careful people who work near the end of life, hospice workers, doctors, chaplains, family members who have sat quietly with someone in their final days, have noted something soft. Even in cultures where death is often feared in the abstract, the actual final hours are frequently gentler than the imagination expected. Not always. Life is complicated, but often, especially when suffering is well cared for, the person seems to drift toward the edge in a way that resembles falling into a very deep sleep. Something loosens, something softens, and then, at some quiet moment, the small warm room is no longer occupied. What happens to the one who was in the room is precisely the question the great traditions have long wondered about. Different answers have been offered, different hopes have been held, different intuitions carried. Science observes the empty room, it does not of itself see beyond it. But here is a small comfort we can carry from tonight into the deep hours to come. The pre-birth silence, on which you already have direct data, was gentle. It was not enduring. It was not lonely. It was simply the absence of a subject in a universe that was busy with other things. And whatever the deeper truth of the far silence is, part of it, at least the part that concerns the transition itself, appears to share the same softness. There is no one in the empty chair. There has never been anyone in the empty chair. So when you look ahead, into the far edge of the interval, you can look with something other than dread. You can look with the same curiosity you might bring to a doorway at the end of a long, warm room. What lies beyond that doorway is not for tonight to settle. Different traditions hold different pictures. Some of them are beautiful. Many of them are honest. All of them contain, in their deepest streams, a certain quietness, a sense that whatever waits on the other side, it is not the frantic horror the anxious mind pictures. You have already crossed one long silence, patiently, without wounds. Whatever else may or may not follow, that first crossing is a small, real gift the universe has already given you, and it is, quietly, enough to loosen a knot the mind sometimes carries, without ever quite deciding to. We have been walking together, softly, for a long time now, and though the mind may not remember every step of the road, some of the shape may still be quietly held in the body, the way you sometimes remember the mood of a dream more clearly than its details. We began in a small lamplit room with the strange fact that for almost 14 billion years you were not here, and it did not hurt. We walked slowly through that number, feeling it as duration rather than statistic. We noticed how atoms of your future body drifted through stars long before there was any you to hold them together. We saw the improbable rehearsal of conditions that allowed a listener to appear at all. We touched, gently, the strange border where a self first flickers into being. We considered how memory forgets almost everything of your earliest years, and how nightly sleep loosens the sense of I without any harm. We visited the small keyhole of anesthesia, and we sat for a while with an ancient mirror argument that quietly said the absence before you and the absence after you are made of the same soft fabric. We turned into physics and considered how time itself may be less like a river and more like a pattern of change. We watched entropy's slow hand shape the universe from an ordered beginning toward a gentler, more even future, and we saw ourselves as small, unlikely pockets of order lit briefly inside that softening. We listened to the anthropic whisper, and we walked lightly past the strange thought experiments of many possible worlds without letting them harden into claims. We stepped into the philosophy of the painless dark. We sat in the garden of Epicurus, in the pause of contemplative traditions from the East, in the open doorways of the great faiths that keep the question of the soul respectfully alive. We considered a modern paradox about information, and we ended, gently, in the honest comfort of not knowing. Then we widened again. We looked at the brief, bright interval of a life against the deep time of geology. We noticed the story quietly written into your DNA, older than anything you can consciously remember. We thought about the others who waited, the ancestors who survived, the almost people who never arrived, the wider street of small lit windows in which you are one. We asked how meaning might not need permanence to be real, and we turned, briefly, toward the far silence ahead, letting the shape of the pre-birth silence soften the imagined shape of what lies beyond. None of this has been solved, in the sense of finished. That was never the plan. The great questions are not that kind of question. They are not puzzles with tidy final pictures. They are companions. They walk with us for a while. They deepen. They soften. They change us in ways too subtle to notice from the inside. If anything has been gathered tonight, it is not a set of conclusions. It is more like a shift in tone. The vast dark on either side of a life, which the anxious mind so often paints in terrifying colours, has been repainted, gently, in softer ones. Not because we have proven anything about what waits, but because we have looked honestly at what is there, and noticed that it is quieter than the fear expected. Whatever you carry from this night, whether it is a particular idea, a specific image, or only a warm mood that lingers into your sleep, you are not asked to hold it tightly. You are only asked to let it rest inside you, the way a small stone rests at the bottom of a pond after being dropped, not doing anything, just there, present, slowly settling. We live in a time that has learnt to trust instruments in remarkable ways. Telescopes have shown us galaxies so distant that their light left before the Earth existed. Microscopes have shown us the delicate machinery inside a single cell. Brain scanners have shown us patterns of activity that shift with every thought and feeling. The instruments are honest. They have widened our world beautifully. But it is worth noticing, especially at the end of a long, thoughtful night, that no instrument yet built has directly seen a thought. It has only seen the physical correlations of thought. No instrument has seen a feeling, it has only seen the biology that accompanies it. And no instrument has ever measured the deepest question of what it is that finds itself, right now, looking out through your eyes and listening in the dark. Scientists themselves are often the first to say this. Careful researchers acknowledge that consciousness, the simple fact that experiences feel like anything at all from the inside, remains one of the great open puzzles. There are proposals, there are ideas, there are useful models, but there is not yet, in any settled sense, a full account of why inner experience arises, or what it truly is. Philosophers sometimes call this the hard problem, and its softness is not a failure of the scientists. It is an honest acknowledgement of how deep the water is, which means that when it comes to the deepest question of tonight, what a self ultimately is, and what may or may not continue when the body's story ends, the instruments do not have the final word. They have very much to say about the body, the brain, and their patterns. They have very little to say about the inner light that seems, somehow, to accompany them. That inner light is not for the instruments to declare or deny. Many traditions across the world have quietly held this territory for a long time. They have offered different names for the light. They have offered different pictures of what happens to it. They have disagreed, sometimes strongly in their details, but they share a certain shape. They agree that the deepest thing about a person is not, in the end, the same as the body that carries it, and that this deepest thing deserves to be treated with reverence. Tonight is not the place to argue among those pictures. Different listeners will carry them differently, and each will be treated with respect. What is worth noticing is that the honest scientist and the honest mystic often meet, on this question, in a shared humility. Both stand at the edge of the sea we spoke of earlier. Both can see that there is a great deal of water beyond the shore. Neither pretends to have crossed it. So when you rest tonight, you can rest inside that humility. You do not have to have decided what the deepest question means. You do not have to have chosen a picture of the soul. You do not have to have resolved anything, in fact. The instruments have not resolved it either, and still, the world goes on, held gently in whatever holds it. That is enough for a night. That is enough for many nights. The door that the instruments cannot reach is, in a sense, the door most worth leaving quietly open. If you carry one small thing forward from this night, let it be this. The long dark before you was kind. Not kind in a warm, loving way. That would be more than we can honestly say. But kind in the sense of gentle, in the sense of not asking anything of you, in the sense of not costing you anything, in the sense of leaving no wound. For 13.8 billion years, you were not here. And in all that time, the universe was busy with other things. Stars were born and grew old. Galaxies drifted and turned. Small worlds formed and cooled. Life began on this one blue planet, and slowly, over an unimaginable stretch, worked its way toward the kind of body that could, one day, become you. And you, in all of that, were not required to endure anything. You were not required to wait. You were not required to be brave. You were simply not yet. The instruments have looked back at that long stretch as best they can. They have measured the faint warmth left over from the earliest moments. They have counted the layers of rock. They have traced the family tree written in DNA. And none of what they have found suggests that any hidden version of you was suffering somewhere in the dark. The dark had no you in it. It had no dread. It had no length. It only had itself. If the anxious mind sometimes says, in the small hours, you were dead for 13.8 billion years, notice what a strange sentence that is. It uses the word you as if a small warm subject was there the whole time, wearing a name tag, waiting for a life, but there was no such subject. There was only what the physicists and geologists tell us, a slowly unfolding cosmos with no one inside its dark stretches. If we speak more honestly, we would say something quieter. There was for 13.8 billion years no you, and when there is no you, there is no one for the dark to hurt. That is the small comfort at the center of tonight. It is not a large promise. It does not answer every question. It does not tell you what waits ahead. But it does gently correct one specific fear, the fear of enduring non-existence as a felt state, because enduring, in that sense, was never something the long dark asked of you. You have already crossed that long dark. You did it without effort. You did it without knowing you were doing it. You did it in a way so complete that no memory could form, because there was no one to form a memory. And here you are, on the other side of that crossing, listening to a voice, warm inside a body, held by a night sky whose lights are older than any word you know. Whatever else may be true about the deeper mystery, and there is much that is true, in many ways, in the deeper mystery, this small piece is quietly given. The dark before you was gentle, and the dark, in whatever form it may take again, is not obviously less gentle than it was. You do not have to solve the rest tonight. You do not have to solve it any night, in fact. Some questions are meant to be lived alongside, not answered. What you can do right now is let the small worried grip in your chest loosen a little. The long dark did not hurt you. The dark does not need to be feared as an enemy. It has already, quietly, kept you safe once, without knowing it was doing so, without asking to be thanked. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is more than enough. Now, gently, let the shape of the night begin to soften. The thoughts we have carried do not need to be held any more tightly. They have done their small work. They can rest now in the quiet places of the mind, where they will keep their own company while you sleep. Notice, if you can, the weight of your body against whatever is holding it. The bed, the pillow, the blanket, the room around you. Notice that these have been present all along, quietly, while ideas and voices have been moving through the room. They are still here. They are not going anywhere. Notice your breath, slow, warm, coming in, going out. You are not asked to change it, only to notice it. It has been breathing itself for a long time, and it knows how to keep breathing while you drift. Somewhere above the roof, the same sky we spoke of is turning. The stars whose light you sometimes see are far older than the mind considering them tonight. They do not need anything from you. They will continue to shine, or to have shone long ago, whether or not you are watching. Their patience is a good companion at this hour. Somewhere, inside you, the slow tide of sleep is already beginning to gather. You may not feel it clearly yet, but it is coming. The eyelids grow a little heavier, the muscles quietly settle, the candles of daily thought begin to dim, one by one, without any hurry. This has happened thousands of nights before. Your body knows the shape of this door. If a thought drifts up, let it drift. You do not have to answer it tonight. It will still be there, if it wants to be, in the morning. Or it will not, and that will be a small kindness too. If a worry stirs, let it soften. There is nothing to solve in this exact moment. The long dark before you did not need your effort. The gentle dark of sleep does not need it either. The world will keep turning without you holding it up for a few hours. You are allowed to set it down. Let the room grow quieter in your mind, even if the room itself has been quiet for a long time. Let the small warm point of you begin to spread out, the way ink spreads gently into water, not vanishing, just softening, just becoming less sharp at the edges. You have already, on many nights, walked across this threshold. You have already, on many nights, come back. There is no reason to think tonight will be different. Sleep is a familiar country now, even if it does not always feel that way from the doorway. Once you cross it, the crossing is easy. It always has been. If you find yourself thinking of the long dark before you, let it stay in its gentle place. It is not an enemy. It is not a stranger. It has already held you, once, without hurting you. It will hold this small stretch of sleep in the same way, and let you go again, softly, into whatever morning comes. There is nothing left to do now, nothing left to figure out, nothing left to prove. The mind can rest, the body can rest, the night can hold what needs to be held for you until you wake. Let your breath grow slower, let the room grow quieter. Let the small circle of light that has been thinking with you all evening dim, gently, at its own pace. You are safe. You are held. You are, for this small warm interval, exactly where you are meant to be. And now, softly, let the long, patient dark do again what it has always done, without ever asking anything of you. Let it hold you, kindly, into sleep.